Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been holding this inside for too long. It's been eating at me for decades, and I think I'm finally ready to share what happened that summer day in 1967. I was 17 then, just a kid really, working through the summer in Bonners Ferry, Idaho, to save up some money before my senior year. It was the kind of summer that sticks with you. Hot, dusty days, cold creek water, and that feeling of being young with your whole life ahead of you. Me, Steve Shaw, and Dale had been working our asses off bucking hay bales at Old Man Harold Ford's farm. Hard work, but good money for teenagers back then. That particular day, July 22nd, a date I'll never forget, we'd finished early, around 4 in the afternoon. The sun was still high, beating down through a clear blue sky with just the slightest breeze. We were all crammed into Harold's pickup truck, heading back to Spirit Lake. Harold had let us use his truck since we'd finished the field a day earlier than expected. Steve was driving, I was in the middle seat, and Dale was pressed against the passenger door. We were dusty, sweaty, and laughing about some stupid joke Dale had made. The windows were rolled down, and I remember the wind whipping through the cab, providing some relief from the heat. The radio was playing something. I can't recall what song, but it was crackling with static as we bounced along that narrow dirt road that cut through thick stands of lodgepole pine. Earlier, we'd stashed some beers in a cold stream running through the back 40 of the farm. We'd grabbed them before leaving, and they were sitting in a cooler at my feet. I remember thinking how good one would taste once we got back to Steve's place in Spirit Lake. The road was rough. Just a single lane in most places with those tall pines pressing in close on both sides, creating these long shadows that stretched across the dirt. We were maybe 5 miles out from the main highway, in that stretch where the forest gets really dense before opening up to farmland again. I don't know why I turned around. There wasn't a sound or anything specific that made me look back. It was this feeling. The hair on the back of my neck just stood up, and I got this electric tingling sensation down my spine. It was like something was watching us. I've never felt anything like it before or since. So I twisted around in my seat to look out the rear window of the truck. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It stepped out from the tree line on the left side of the road, maybe 30 yards behind us as we drove away. It was tall, so much taller than any man I'd ever seen, 7 feet at least, maybe more, and completely covered in hair from head to toe, this dark brown, almost reddish color that caught the sunlight filtering through the trees. It wasn't an animal, not in the way we think of animals. It walked on 2 legs, completely upright, human-like, but not human. The stride was different, longer, more fluid somehow, powerful. It crossed that road in 4 steps, from one side to the other, a road that would have taken me at least 8 or 9 strides to cross. The arms were long, hanging down past where a human's would end, and the shoulders, Jesus, the width of those shoulders, massive, like a linebacker, but bigger. The head sat directly on those shoulders, no real neck to speak of, and it was kind of conical shaped, coming to a slight point at the top. What struck me most was how it moved. It wasn't running or hurrying, it just walked, deliberate. Like it had somewhere to be and we weren't worth noticing. It never once turned its head toward our truck, never acknowledged we were there at all. Like we were so insignificant it didn't matter if we saw it or not. The whole thing lasted maybe 5 seconds. 5 seconds that have haunted me for over 50 years now. I remember gripping the seat so hard, my knuckles went white. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. No words, not even a sound. I wanted to yell, to point, to grab Steve or Dale and make them look, but my body wouldn't respond. I was completely frozen. Then it was gone, disappearing into the thick pines on the right side of the road, just gone, like it had never been there at all. I spun back around in my seat, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Steve and Dale were still talking, laughing about something. The radio was still playing. Everything was normal except for me, sitting there with cold sweat breaking out all over my body despite the July heat. "You okay, Jackson?" Steve asked, glancing over at me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I remember swallowing hard, my mouth suddenly bone dry. "Yeah," I managed to say. "Just thought I saw something in the trees back there." "Probably just a deer," Dale said, not even bothering to look back. "Saw a big buck crossing this same road yesterday." That wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear standing up. It wasn't a man in a costume. I know what I saw. I didn't say anything else about it. Not then, not on the drive back to Spirit Lake, not when we cracked open those beers at Steve's place while his parents were away for the weekend. Not ever, to anyone, for decades. The rest of that day is a blur in my memory. I remember sitting on Steve's porch, beer in hand, barely tasting it, barely hearing the conversation around me. My mind kept replaying those 5 seconds over and over, the way it moved, the sheer size of it, how it seemed so purposeful. I kept wondering if Steve or Dale had glimpsed it in the rearview mirror, if Harold Ford or other locals knew these things were out there. If anyone would believe me if I told them. That night I barely slept. Every crack of a branch outside, every rustle of leaves had me bolt upright in my sleeping bag on Steve's living room floor. I kept seeing those few seconds playing on a loop behind my closed eyelids. The next day, I made an excuse about my stomach bothering me and spent most of the time inside while Steve and Dale went swimming at the lake. I kept thinking about going back to that spot, to look for tracks or hair or something. Anything to prove to myself I hadn't imagined it. But the thought of being alone in those woods, of potentially encountering that thing again, I couldn't do it. We worked 2 more weeks for Harold Ford that summer, and every time we drove down that road, I stared into those trees, heart in my throat, both hoping and fearing I'd see it again. But there was nothing. Just pines and undergrowth and occasional wildlife. Normal wildlife. When summer ended, I went back home to finish high school. I never told my parents, never told my friends back home. Who would believe me? This was 1967. People didn't talk about these things, not seriously anyway. You'd be laughed out of town, or worse, labeled the town nutcase. So I kept it to myself. For years, through college, my first job, meeting my wife, starting a family. It was this secret I carried, this thing I saw that shouldn't exist but did. I read books about it in secret. In the 70s and 80s, when more reports started coming out, I'd scan newspaper articles, looking for anything similar to what I'd seen. Sometimes I'd find accounts that would make my blood run cold. Descriptions so similar to my experience that I knew others had seen it too. It wasn't until 1993, 26 years later, that I went back to Spirit Lake with my wife. I told her I wanted to show her where I'd spent that summer before senior year. The truth was, I needed to go back, needed to see that road again. The town had changed some, but not as much as you might expect. We found Steve still living there, married with kids of his own by then. We had dinner, caught up on old times. Dale had moved to Oregon years before. Harold Ford had passed away in '86. Over beers, after our wives had stepped away to chat, I almost told Steve. Almost asked if he'd ever seen anything strange in those woods. The words were right there on the tip of my tongue. But I didn't. Some part of me was still afraid. Not of being ridiculed, not anymore, but afraid that talking about it might somehow make it more real than it already was for me. Or worse, that Steve would confirm he'd seen it too. seen something I'd spent decades trying to half convince myself might have been a bizarre trick of light and shadow. We did visit the local library, where I met an elderly town historian who remembered that summer well. There had been unusual reports that year, livestock going missing, strange sounds in the woods at night, hunters finding their game carcasses stolen from where they'd hung them. Nothing concrete, nothing anyone could prove, just oddities. I asked about the road, that specific stretch through the pines. He looked at me strangely for a moment before mentioning that locals had always considered that area a bit off. No real stories attached to it, just a general sense of unease. People didn't linger there if they could help it. My wife and I drove down that road before we left town. It was wider now, partially paved in sections, but still remote. The pines were taller, but otherwise it looked almost the same. I found myself scanning the tree line, heart beating faster with each passing minute. Pretty area, my wife said, oblivious to my inner turmoil. So isolated, though. You could hide an army in these woods and no one would know. Or something else, I thought, but didn't say. I've thought a lot over the years about why I kept silent. Part of it was fear of ridicule, sure. But there was something else, too. A strange sense of protectiveness. Whatever I saw that day wasn't threatening us. It was just existing, living its life in these remote woods. What would happen if people knew for certain these creatures were real? They'd hunt them, study them, destroy their habitat. Maybe my silence was a kind of respect, an acknowledgement that some things deserve to remain mysteries. But I'm older now, in my 70s, with grandkids who ask me to tell them scary stories, and I realize that keeping this inside hasn't done me any favors. The memory is just as vivid, just as disconcerting as it was that summer day in 1967. So I'm telling it now. Take from it what you will. Believe me or don't, it doesn't really matter anymore. I know what I saw crossing that dusty road in the Idaho woods. I know how it made me feel. That mixture of awe and primal fear that only comes when you're confronted with something your mind tells you shouldn't exist. It was real. It was there. And for 5 seconds on a summer afternoon in 1967, our worlds intersected before continuing on their separate paths. To this day, I still find myself looking a little longer, a little harder into dense forests when I pass them, wondering if something is looking back. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, I get that same prickly feeling on the back of my neck, that same electric tingle down my spine. And I know somehow that I'm being watched. But when I turn to look, there's never anything there. At least, nothing I can see. Story 2. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family and the others who were there that night. It's been 55 years, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was the summer of '68. Laura and I had just gotten married in May, and we were still in that honeymoon phase, where everything feels magical. We were young and carefree. I was 23, Laura 21. Our friends Michael and Rebecca had gotten hitched about a year before us, and they suggested we all go camping together at this new spot in Bear Lake County, Idaho. The Forest Service had just cleared this area for camping, and when I say cleared, I mean they basically just designated it as a campground. There were no facilities, no picnic tables, nothing like that. Just a small opening in the woods where you could park a car and set up camp. It wasn't on any maps yet, and Michael only knew about it because his uncle worked for the Forest Service. He told us we'd have the place to ourselves, and he wasn't kidding. We packed up Michael's station wagon with our sleeping bags, a cooler full of beer and hot dogs, and enough supplies for a 3-day weekend. The drive from Salt Lake took about 2.5 hours. I remember Laura and Rebecca singing along to the radio. Hey Jude had just come out that summer, while Michael and I talked about the fishing prospects. When we finally arrived, the sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains. The spot was beautiful, but definitely isolated. We had to take this unmarked dirt road that wound through dense pine forest for about 20 minutes before reaching the clearing. There wasn't another human for miles around, as far as I could tell. The campground, if you could even call it that, was basically just a small meadow surrounded by thick forest. Behind us was a steep hillside spotted with limestone formations and what looked like cave openings. The whole place had this strange atmosphere, like it was somehow untouched by time. Even Laura, who was usually so excited about our outdoor adventures, commented that it felt off somehow. I brushed it off as just the unfamiliarity of a new place. We decided to sleep under the stars that night. The weather was perfect, warm with a slight breeze, and we didn't bother with tents. We laid our sleeping bags out in pairs, about 6 feet apart from each other. After a dinner of hot dogs and beans, we sat around the campfire drinking beer and telling stories until Rebecca and Laura started nodding off around midnight. After the girls went to sleep, Michael and I stayed up talking. We kept our voices low, passing a flask of whiskey back and forth while the fire died down to embers. I remember Michael saying something that struck me as odd at the time. "Does this place feel weird to you?" he asked, looking around at the dark tree line. "What do you mean by weird?" I replied, taking a sip of whiskey. "I don't know, man. Like we're being watched or something." I laughed it off. Probably just a family of deer checking us out. But now I wonder if Michael sensed something that I didn't. At least, not yet. Around 2:30 or 3 in the morning, we finally decided to call it a night. I crawled into my sleeping bag next to Laura, who was sound asleep. I remember looking up at the stars, feeling that pleasant buzz from the whiskey, and thinking how perfect life was at that moment. The fire had died down to just a faint orange glow, and the forest around us was absolutely silent. No insects chirping, no owls hooting, nothing. I should have realized then that something was off. I was just starting to drift off when I felt it. It's hard to explain, but it was like a sudden weight pressing down on my consciousness. My eyes snapped open, and I was instantly alert, every muscle in my body tense. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was a feeling. The overwhelming sensation that something was watching me, not us, but me specifically. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake Laura. The moon was bright enough that I could see the clearing and the edge of the forest pretty clearly, and that's when I saw it. At the tree line, maybe 100 feet away from our sleeping bags, stood something that I still struggle to describe adequately. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and completely black, like a shadow-given form. The shape was unmistakably humanoid, but wrong somehow. The proportions weren't right. The arms hung too low, the shoulders too broad. I couldn't make out any facial features at that distance in the darkness, but I knew it was looking directly at me. I could feel its gaze like a physical touch. I was frozen, not out of fear exactly, but from some primal instinct that told me not to move, not to provoke it. I heard rustling beside me and realized Michael was awake too. He had sat up in his sleeping bag and was staring at the same spot. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, not taking my eyes off the figure. "What the hell is it?" Michael's voice trembled slightly. "I don't know," I replied. For what felt like an eternity, probably only a few minutes in reality, we just stared at it, and it stared back. It never moved, never made a sound. The girls remained asleep, blissfully unaware. The strangest part was that after the initial shock, I didn't feel afraid. There was this odd sense of communication happening, though no words were exchanged. I just knew somehow that it wasn't going to hurt us as long as we didn't threaten it. "I think we should just lie down and go back to sleep," I said to Michael, the words coming out of my mouth almost without my conscious decision. Michael looked at me like I was crazy. "Are you serious? With that thing standing there?" "It's not going to hurt us," I said, with a certainty I couldn't explain. "I think it's just curious. Michael hesitated, then slowly nodded. This is insane, but okay. We both laid back down in our sleeping bags. I expected to lie awake all night, my eyes fixed on that dark figure, but the moment my head touched the ground, an overwhelming drowsiness came over me. It wasn't natural. 1 second I was wide awake, heart pounding, and the next I was fighting to keep my eyes open. The last thing I remember was watching the figure, still motionless at the edge of the trees, as my eyelids grew impossibly heavy. I woke up the next morning to the sound of birds and sunlight filtering through the trees. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamed the whole thing, but one look at Michael's face as he emerged from his sleeping bag told me it had been real. We exchanged a glance, but didn't say anything in front of the girls. After breakfast, while Laura and Rebecca were down at the creek washing dishes, Michael pulled me aside. "What the hell was that last night?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've never seen anything like it. And that feeling, like it was controlling us somehow, making us go back to sleep." I nodded. "You felt that too?" "Yeah. It was like being drugged or hypnotized or something. We tried to make sense of it, but nothing fit. This was 1968, remember? I'd never even heard of Bigfoot back then. The Patterson-Gimlin film had only come out the year before, and it wasn't widely known yet, at least not in our circles. The rest of the day, we explored the area. The limestone formations on the hillside were riddled with small caves and crevices. Some went back pretty deep. We could shine our flashlights in and not see the end of them. The whole place had this primitive, almost prehistoric feel to it, like we'd stepped back in time thousands of years. We found some unusual things that day that I didn't connect to our visitor until much later. Strange broken branches, high up in trees that no deer could reach. Areas where the underbrush was flattened in circular patterns like nesting spots. And once, what looked like an enormous footprint in some soft soil near the creek. It was at least 16 inches long, but it had been partially washed away by water, so I dismissed it at the time. That night, neither Michael nor I mentioned what we'd seen. We built a bigger fire, drank a little more, and made sure to go to bed when the girls did. Nothing happened that second night, or at least nothing that I was conscious of. But when I woke up the next morning, I found 3 small rocks, stacked one on top of another, right next to my sleeping bag. They hadn't been there when I went to sleep, and nobody in our group admitted to placing them there. On our last day, as we were packing up to leave, Laura found something that sent a chill down my spine. Stuck to the side of our cooler was a clump of dark, coarse hair, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was too thick to be human, too long to be bare, and when I rubbed it between my fingers, it had an almost oily quality to it. I wrapped it in a handkerchief and stuck it in my pocket, planning to examine it more closely when we got home. But here's the strangest part. When we got back to Salt Lake, the handkerchief was empty. The hair was gone, with no trace that it had ever been there. The small rocks I'd collected from beside my sleeping bag were gone from my backpack too. It was as if the evidence couldn't exist outside that place. Michael and I talked about it once or twice in the weeks after, but we eventually stopped. What was there to say? We had no framework to understand what we'd seen, and honestly, part of me didn't want to understand it. There was something ancient and primal about the encounter that made me feel like I had glimpsed something humans weren't meant to see. Over the years, I've read about similar encounters people have had in remote areas. The feeling of being watched, the dark figures, the strange mental effects. Some call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others use different names. I don't know what to call it, but I know what I saw. I've never been back to that specific spot. Laura and I returned to Bear Lake many times over the years with our kids, but never to that particular clearing. I doubt I could even find it now. The whole area has been developed with paved roads and proper campgrounds. The wild, untouched place we visited that summer exists only in my memory, Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the trees, observing as humans gradually encroach on its territory. Or maybe it retreated deeper into the wilderness, into places we haven't touched yet. I'm 78 now. Laura passed away 3 years ago, and Michael followed last spring. Rebecca moved to Arizona after her divorce in the 80s, and we lost touch. I'm the last one who was there that night, the last one who remembers. I still dream about it sometimes. In my dreams, I see those eyes watching me from the darkness, not threatening, not malevolent, just aware, ancient, and somehow impossibly familiar, like it knew me and I knew it from some place beyond memory. I don't know what it was that I saw that night in Bear Lake County. All I know is that for a brief moment, the veil between our world and something older, something wilder, grew thin enough for me to glimpse what's on the other side, and it glimpsed me too. Story 3. Let me start by saying I've never been a person who believed in crazy stuff. I grew up in a pretty normal family in northern Idaho. Dad was a carpenter, Mom worked at the elementary school, we went to church on Sundays. You know, totally regular life. I was 20 years old in the summer of '69, home from my second year of college in Boise, working at my uncle's hardware store to save up money for fall semester. I want to be clear that what I'm about to share isn't something I talk about often. My friends who were there that night, we don't bring it up when we get together anymore. It's been over 50 years now, but I can still remember every detail like it happened yesterday. It was Saturday, August 16th, 1969. I remember the date because we'd been talking about Woodstock that day. It had just started, and my buddy Mike kept saying we should have ditched Idaho and gone to New York. The weather was perfect that evening, about 65 degrees, not too cold, not too hot. The sky was crystal clear with stars everywhere. One of those perfect summer nights in the mountains that make you feel lucky to be alive. I'd been dating this girl named Sarah for about 3 months. She was pretty, smart, and her parents liked me, which was a bonus. We'd planned to go out with my friend Mike and his girlfriend Donna. Mike had this nice Chevy Impala his dad had helped him buy, and we often doubled up for dates to save on gas. After we saw a movie in town, can't even remember what it was now, Mike suggested we drive out to Payette Lake. There was this spot on the east side where couples would sometimes park. It wasn't anything scandalous, just a place to talk and maybe make out a little without parents around. Back then, McCall was much less developed. Where there are fancy houses and resorts now, there were just trees and open spaces. We got to the spot around 9:30. It was dark already, but with the stars and a bit of moonlight, you could still make out the shapes of trees and the road. The lake was about 200 feet away through the pines and Douglas firs. Mike parked the car facing out toward a small clearing, then turned the engine and lights off. For a while, we just sat there talking, the 4 of us. Then Mike and Donna decided they wanted some air and went to sit on the trunk of the car. Sarah and I stayed inside with the windows rolled up. We were just talking and kissing, nothing crazy. The radio was playing softly. I think it was some Beatles song. About 20 minutes had passed when Mike tapped on the window. I remember feeling annoyed at first, thinking he was just trying to mess with us, but when I looked up, I could see his face in the darkness, and he looked concerned. I rolled the window down. "What's up?" I asked. Mike leaned in close and whispered, even though we were the only ones around for miles. "There's something out there," he said. "Something big walked around the car while we were sitting here. I heard it moving through the brush." "Probably just a deer," I said, though I could tell by his expression he didn't think so. "No, man. It was walking on 2 legs. I heard it circling the car, and now I think it's in front of us, maybe 20 feet ahead." Donna was standing right behind him, and she nodded. "I heard it too. It didn't sound like a deer." Now, in that part of Idaho, bears weren't uncommon. My immediate thought was that we had a black bear checking us out. which could be dangerous if it decided we had food. "We should probably get out of here," I said. Sarah squeezed my hand tight. I could feel her trembling slightly. Mike nodded. "Yeah, I'm gonna start the car. If it's a bear, we don't want to be trapped here." He and Donna quickly got back in the front seats. Mike put the key in the ignition but paused before turning it. "Wait," he whispered. "I want to see what it is. Maybe it's just someone messing with us." Before any of us could object, he flipped on the headlights. I'll never forget what happened next. The headlights illuminated the small clearing in front of us, and there, about 15 feet away at the edge where the trees started, was something standing upright. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It was about 6 feet tall, covered in black, dense fur or hair that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The body was bulky, but not fat, muscular, like a weightlifter. The arms hung down at its sides, longer than a human's would be. The face was dark, partially shadowed, but I could see it had a pronounced brow ridge. The eyes caught the headlights for just a split second, and they reflected back with a reddish glow, like a deer's eyes do, but these were set forward in the face. For 1, maybe 2 seconds, it just stood there, seemingly as surprised to see us as we were to see it. Then, and this is the part that still gives me chills, it spun around on its heels with a quickness that didn't seem possible for something that size. It moved with athletic precision, like a basketball player doing a pivot, and then it was gone, crashing through the underbrush into the forest. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than a couple of seconds, but in that brief moment, all 4 of us saw it clearly. No one spoke for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Sarah was the first to break the silence with a shaky, "What was that?" Mike didn't answer. He just started the car, threw it into reverse, and got us out of there as fast as he could. We were all breathing hard, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. "Did you guys see that?" Mike finally asked once we were back on the main road heading toward town. "Tell me you saw that." "I saw it," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Me too," Sarah whispered. Donna just nodded, looking pale even in the dim dashboard light. "That wasn't a bear," Mike said. "Bears don't stand like that. And did you see how fast it moved? Nothing that big should be able to move that quick." We drove back to town in a state of shock. We didn't talk much about what we'd seen, not right away. It was like our brains couldn't process it. We dropped the girls off at Sarah's house. Neither of them wanted to be alone. And then Mike drove me home. As he was idling in my driveway, Mike finally said what we'd both been thinking. "That was a Bigfoot, wasn't it?" I wanted to laugh it off, to say he was being ridiculous. Bigfoot was just a story, something to scare kids or sell newspapers, but I'd seen it with my own eyes. "I think it might have been," I admitted. "What do we do?" Mike asked. "I don't know," I said. "Who would believe us?" We decided to talk about it the next day after we'd had some sleep, though I knew sleep wouldn't come easy that night. And it didn't. I lay awake, replaying those seconds in my mind. The way it stood there, the way it moved, the absolute silence of the moment, except for our breathing inside the car. The next morning, we met up at the diner in town. All 4 of us looked like we hadn't slept. We found a booth in the back corner where no one could overhear us. "So," Mike said once we had our coffees, "did that really happen?" We looked at each other. Slowly, we all nodded. "What exactly did we see?" Donna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we all saw the same thing. We compared notes on what we'd witnessed. Our descriptions matched almost perfectly. 6 feet tall, covered in black fur, standing upright, incredibly fast movement. The only difference was that Donna thought it might have been slightly taller, maybe 6.5 feet. "What about its face?" Sarah asked. "Did anyone get a good look at its face?" None of us had. It had been partially shadowed, and the sighting was so brief. but we all agreed on the pronounced brow ridge and the eyes that caught the light. "Should we tell someone?" Donna asked. "Who?" Mike replied. "The police? What would we say? Excuse me, officer, but we saw Bigfoot while we were parking at the lake?" He had a point. We'd be laughed out of town. Plus, my dad would kill me if he found out I was at the lake with Sarah after dark. "Maybe a park ranger?" Sarah suggested. "They might want to know if there's something unusual in the woods." In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves, at least for a while. We agreed to go back during daylight to see if there were any signs, footprints or broken branches. But when we drove out there that afternoon, we couldn't find anything definitive. The ground was too dry and hard-packed to show prints clearly. Over the next few weeks, we quietly asked around town if anyone else had seen anything strange in the woods near Payette Lake. Most people just gave us weird looks or laughed it off. A few old-timers had stories of strange noises in the night or livestock acting spooked, but nothing concrete. Eventually, when school started back up, Sarah and I broke up. She was staying in McCall, and I was heading back to Boise. Mike and Donna lasted a bit longer, but split up by Christmas. We all stayed in touch for a while, connected by this thing we'd experienced together. But as the years passed, we drifted apart like people do. I went back to that spot by the lake a few times over the years, always during the day. The last time I visited was probably in the mid-90s. The area had been completely developed by then. What had once been a secluded spot in the woods was now home to tennis courts for some fancy resort. Standing there on the manicured lawn, it was hard to imagine what we'd seen that night. Sometimes I wonder if my memory has played tricks on me over the decades. Maybe it really was just a bear standing oddly, or some local playing a prank. But then I remember the way it moved, that incredibly fast pivot, and the speed with which it disappeared into the forest. No human could have moved like that, and no bear stands that way or runs on two legs with that kind of agility. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, and some descriptions match what we saw that night. Sometimes I think about contacting one of those research groups to tell my story, but what would be the point after all this time? I have no evidence, just the memory of a few seconds from more than 50 years ago, but I know what I saw, what all four of us saw. Something was in those woods that night, something that wasn't supposed to exist. The strangest part? I'm not afraid to go into the woods now. If anything, I feel a weird sort of connection to those remote places where civilization hasn't quite taken over. I just find myself looking over my shoulder a little more often, scanning the tree line for movement, and occasionally wondering if I'm being watched. Because if there was one out there that night, there are probably others, and they've managed to stay hidden all this time, which means they're smart. Maybe smarter than we give them credit for. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. I barely believe it myself sometimes, but it happened. On a clear August night in 1969, 4 normal young people saw something extraordinary, and nothing has ever been quite the same since. Story 4. I've never really shared this story with many people. For the longest time, I kept it to myself because I was afraid nobody would believe me. Even now, over 50 years later, I can still see it all so clearly in my head. I guess I'm finally at an age where I don't much care if people think I'm crazy or making it up. I know what I saw. This happened back in October of 1969. I was just 7 years old at the time, living in Bonner County, Idaho. My grandfather was a logging contractor who knew those mountains better than anyone. He'd been working the forests around there since he was a teenager, and he used to take me along sometimes when he was scouting for timber. I always loved those trips, just me and Grandpa in his old Ford pickup, driving through those huge forests, him pointing out different types of trees and teaching me about the woods. This particular day was a Wednesday, I remember, because I'd gotten out of school early for a teacher conference. My mom dropped me at Grandpa's, and he said he needed to check out an area up near what the locals called High Drive. It was this narrow, winding forest service road cut right into the mountainside above this big lake. Pretty remote, even for Idaho standards. The weather was cool but not freezing yet. Classic October in North Idaho. Leaves were changing, lots of gold and red in the forest. We'd spent most of the afternoon driving around while Grandpa made notes about potential logging areas. I was just enjoying being out there, watching deer occasionally or asking Grandpa questions about whatever popped into my head. It was getting on toward evening, maybe around 5 o'clock. The sun wasn't down yet, but it was that time when the forest starts to get this sort of golden, darker light. We were moving slow on that road, probably no more than 20 miles per hour. Grandpa always drove carefully on those mountain roads. They were rough, full of potholes, and had these steep drop-offs on one side. I remember I was fiddling with the radio, trying to find something besides static, when Grandpa suddenly slammed on the brakes and the truck jerked to a stop. I looked up, and that's when I heard him curse, something I rarely heard him do. "Jesus Christ," he said, not shouting, but in this tight, serious voice I'd never heard before. I followed his gaze through the windshield, and that's when I saw it. I still get goosebumps even now telling this. This thing was crossing the road maybe 30 feet ahead of us. It came from the uphill side, moving down toward the slope below the road. My first thought, I swear this is true, was, that's not a bear. Because we saw bears sometimes, and my brain immediately knew this wasn't one. It was huge, massive, and dark, like a deep chocolate brown color. It was covered head to toe in hair or fur, not patchy but thick and uniform. What struck me most was how it moved. It was on 2 legs, but not like a person exactly. It had this stride that was powerful. Its arms were long, way longer than a person's should be, and they swung in this exaggerated way as it moved, almost like they were helping it balance or something. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than a few seconds. The thing crossed the entire width of the road in 2, maybe 3 strides. That road was probably 15 feet wide, and it was across in an instant, descending down the steep slope on the other side. I was frozen, completely frozen. It felt like all the air got sucked out of my lungs. Grandpa grabbed his rifle from the rack behind our seat, he always had it with him in the woods, and jumped out of the truck. I remember he left the door hanging open and the engine running. "Stay put, Sammy," he ordered, and then he was at the edge of the road, looking down the slope where the thing had disappeared. I unbuckled my seatbelt and slid over to the driver's side to see better. Grandpa was scanning the woods below, rifle ready but not raised. We could hear crashing noises, brush breaking, and the sounds of something big moving downhill fast. But we couldn't see anything through the thick trees. After maybe a minute, the sounds faded. Grandpa stood there a bit longer, then slowly walked back to the truck. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking a little as he put the rifle back. "What was that, Grandpa?" I asked, my voice coming out tiny and scared. He didn't answer right away. He just sat there, gripping the steering wheel and staring ahead. Finally, he started the truck moving again. "Not sure, buddy," he said after a while. "Probably just a bear." But I knew it wasn't a bear, and I knew Grandpa knew it too. The thing was walking upright the whole time, and it was tall, so much taller than any person I'd ever seen. Looking back as an adult, I'd guess it was around 8 feet tall, maybe more, but to 7-year-old me, it looked like a giant. What stayed with me all these years is how fast it moved. This wasn't some lumbering, slow creature. It crossed that road and went down that steep embankment with this grace, I guess you'd call it. Like it was perfectly adapted to moving through that rough terrain. The slope below the road dropped off at maybe a 45-degree angle, covered in trees and underbrush, and this thing just descended it like it was nothing. For the rest of the drive home, Grandpa was quiet. Really quiet. He kept checking the rear-view mirror, and he drove faster than usual. I remember he took a different route back too, a longer way that stuck to more main roads. That night at Grandpa's house, I was staying over. I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that thing in my mind, the way its shoulders were so wide and how its head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders without much of a neck. The hair on it was shaggy, not like fur exactly, more like really long human hair but all over its body. The next morning, I tried to ask Grandpa about it again, but he shut me down pretty quick. "Listen, Sammy," he said, real serious-like. "Sometimes we see things in the woods that are hard to explain. Best not to talk about it too much. People will think you're crazy." But later that day, I overheard him on the phone with someone talking low. I only caught bits of it. Never seen anything like it in 40 years in these woods. And wasn't no damn bear, I'll tell you that much. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares. I'd wake up thinking that thing was outside my window, watching me. My mom noticed something was wrong, but when I tried to tell her what we'd seen, she just said I had an overactive imagination from spending too much time with Grandpa and his tall tales. But Grandpa never told tall tales. He was the most straightforward, honest man I've ever known. I didn't bring it up with Grandpa again until years later, when I was about 15. We were driving through that same area, and I asked him if he remembered that day. He got real quiet again, then finally said, "Some things in these mountains are best left alone, Sam." That was the only acknowledgement I ever got from him, that what we'd seen was real and not normal. He passed away a few years later, and I've always regretted not talking to him more about it while I had the chance. I've thought about that day thousands of times over the years. What made the biggest impression on me wasn't just how the creature looked, but the feeling I got when I saw it. It's hard to explain, but it was this deep, primal fear. Like my body knew this was something humans weren't supposed to encounter. Something ancient that belonged to the wilderness in a way we no longer do. The location of the sighting has always seemed significant to me too. That road, High Drive, it created this perfect crossing point. The way it was cut into the mountainside meant there was forest both above and below the road. Looking back, it makes sense that if something was traveling through that territory, it would have to cross that road at some point to move between the higher and lower elevations. The area itself was incredibly remote. Even now, parts of Bonner County are still pretty isolated, but back then, there were huge stretches where you could go days without seeing another person. The forests were denser, the logging less extensive. It was exactly the kind of place where something could hide, could live for years without being detected. I've read accounts of other people's experiences over the years, and many details match what we saw. The height, the way it moved, the arm length and swinging motion. I know now what we encountered was what some people call Sasquatch or Bigfoot, though Grandpa never used either of those terms. To him, it was just that thing in the woods. Sometimes I wonder if skeptics have ever truly been in wilderness like that. Deep, old-growth forest that stretches for hundreds of miles, where cell phones don't work and help is hours away. It's a different world out there. Things can hide, things can survive unseen. I went back to that exact spot on High Drive about 10 years ago. The road's been improved somewhat, widened in places, but that section still looks pretty much the same, still cut into the side of the mountain with that steep drop-off. I pulled over right where I thought we'd stopped that day and just sat there for a while, listening to the forest, half expecting to see that same dark shape emerge from the trees. Nothing appeared, of course, but standing there as an adult, I realized something that made the whole experience even more chilling. Whatever we saw that day, it would have heard and seen our truck coming. That road was noisy. You could hear vehicles from quite a distance, which means it chose to cross when it did. It either misjudged our distance, or it simply didn't care if we saw it. That thought bothers me more than anything else. Not that these things exist. I made peace with that a long time ago, but that this one was so confident, so at home in its environment, that our presence was just a minor inconvenience to be dealt with. We weren't threats or even concerns, just something to be avoided with a quick dash across an opening. I've never gone camping alone since that day, not once. I still go into the woods. I live in Idaho after all, but always with other people, always with a fire at night, and always with the feeling that I'm being watched from just beyond the reach of the firelight. I know this probably sounds crazy to most people reading this. Trust me, I've questioned my own memory over the years. But then I remember Grandpa's face that day, how pale he got, how his hands shook. This was a man who'd fought in World War II, who'd faced down charging black bears, who wasn't afraid of anything in those woods, until that day in October 1969. If you're ever driving on some remote Forest Service road as evening approaches, and you get that feeling of being watched, maybe don't stop to see what it is. Some things in the wilderness really are better left alone, and sometimes they're watching you long before you ever see them. I'm 60 years old now, and I've never been more certain of anything in my life than what we saw that day. Whatever it was crossed that road in front of our truck. It was no bear, no person in a suit, and no figment of a child's imagination. It was real, it was there, and for all I know, its descendants still move through those same forests today, occasionally crossing roads when they think no one is watching. Story 5. I've spent my whole life in the wilds of Idaho. Since I was 12, every October meant hunting season, when Dad would take me out into the mountains. By the time I was 35, I could track deer better than most locals, knew every trail within 50 miles of our home, and had stories for every ridge and valley. But I don't go into those woods anymore. Not since October of '72. It's been 36 years, and I still wake up some nights seeing those eyes. My wife Helen says I call out in my sleep sometimes. I never told her what I saw that day. Couldn't bring myself to. Only recently did I tell my son, and even then, I couldn't get all the details out without my hands starting to shake. It was the second weekend of hunting season. A crisp autumn morning when the trees were at their most brilliant. Helen decided to come along for exercise. Though she didn't carry a rifle, she never enjoyed the hunt itself, but she loved the hiking and fresh mountain air. We had been married 17 years by then, and I was glad for her company that morning, though later I'd be grateful she didn't see what I saw. We parked our truck at the base of what locals call the incline near Mary's Creek Road. It's steeper than it looks, a gradual slope that turns into a proper hike after the first mile. The area was dense with pines and undergrowth, but I knew a trail that followed a natural contour up the mountainside. Beautiful day for it, Helen said as we started up. And it was cool enough that your breath showed just slightly in the morning air, but warm enough that you didn't need more than a jacket. Perfect hunting weather. We'd been walking maybe 45 minutes when we encountered another hunter coming down the trail toward us. He was moving fast, not quite running, but close to it, clutching his rifle and looking back over his shoulder every few steps. "Morning," I called, thinking maybe he was tracking something. He startled when he saw us, like he hadn't expected to meet anyone. His face was flushed, eyes wide. "You folks heading up?" he asked, breathing hard. "That's the plan," I replied. "Something wrong?" "Just jumped a black elk up there," he said, gesturing vaguely behind him. "Biggest damn thing I've ever seen. Couldn't get a shot off." He kept moving past us, still glancing backward. "Watch yourselves up there." Helen and I exchanged looks. Black elk aren't common in these parts, and the way he was acting seemed off. But hunters get excited about their sightings, and I didn't think much more about it. "Want to see if we can spot his elk?" I asked Helen with a smile. "Lead the way," she said. We continued up the trail for another 20 minutes. The forest was getting denser, with thicker underbrush and trees growing closer together. Eventually, we came to a small clearing I recognized, maybe 30 yards across, with tall grass and a few saplings scattered throughout. On the far side, the mature forest resumed, dark and thick. I paused at the edge of the clearing, scanning the tree line. Movement caught my eye, just a slight shifting of shadow about 75 yards away, at the edge of the woods on the other side. "Hold up," I whispered to Helen, who stopped beside me. I raised my rifle, a Remington 30-06 with a decent scope set at 3-power magnification. Not powerful enough for long-distance shots, but perfect for the kind of hunting I did. I peered through the scope, adjusting focus on the spot where I'd seen movement. For a second, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then I found it. At first, I thought it was a bear standing upright. We get black bears in these parts, and occasionally one will stand to get a better look or reach for berries. But as my eyes adjusted to what I was seeing through the scope, I realized this was no bear. Behind a small tree, maybe 6 inches in diameter, stood something I still struggled to describe properly. It was black, or very dark brown, covered in hair that looked coarse and thick, like a bison's winter coat. But this was no bison. It was tall, impossibly tall. I'd later estimate 10 feet at minimum, though in the moment all I registered was that it was the biggest bipedal thing I'd ever seen. Its proportions were all wrong for a human. Its shoulders were massive, sloped, with no visible neck. Its head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders with a distinctly domed shape to the skull. The face. God, the face. I could see it clearly through my scope. The hair was shorter there, revealing dark skin. Its eyes were what struck me most, large, set deep under a prominent brow ridge, and fixed directly on me. Not in the way an animal looks at you, with curiosity or fear. This thing was studying me, recognizing me, understanding me. One enormous hand, if you could call it that, wrapped around the tree trunk it stood behind. I could see long fingers that must have been touching the thumb on the other side of the trunk. Its chest was barrel-shaped, expanding and contracting with each breath. I don't know how long I stared at it through my scope. Time seemed to stop. All I know is that it didn't move an inch, just stood there, breathing, watching me with those terrible eyes. I became aware of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. My hands began to shake so badly I could barely keep the crosshairs on the creature. "What do you see?" Helen whispered beside me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I had forgotten she was there. I couldn't tell her, couldn't form the words. Something primal in me knew that acknowledging what I was seeing would make it real, would shatter the thin veneer of normality I was desperately clinging to. "Just a shadow," I managed to say, my voice surprisingly steady. "Thought I saw something." I lowered my rifle for just a moment, blinking to clear my vision, wondering if exhaustion or some trick of light was causing me to hallucinate. When I raised the scope back to my eye, the figure was gone, vanished completely. I scanned the tree line frantically, but there was no sign of movement, no breaking branches, nothing to indicate which way a 1,000-pound creature might have gone. It had disappeared without a sound. "I think we should head back to the truck," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Already? We've barely started," Helen replied. "I've got a feeling about today," I said lamely. "Nothing's moving. We can try a different spot." Helen gave me a strange look, but didn't argue. As we turned around and began walking back down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. My rifle, which I'd carried comfortably for decades, felt useless in my hands. We made it back to the truck without incident. I drove us home in silence, claiming a headache when Helen asked what was wrong. That night, I put my rifle in the closet and haven't touched it since. I sold my dirt bike the following spring, cancelled our family camping trip that summer with some excuse about work. Helen noticed the change, but never pressed the issue beyond asking occasionally if I wanted to go hiking. The truth is, I couldn't bear the thought of being in those woods again. Not with the knowledge that something like that was out there. Something that looked at me with intelligence. Something that disappeared without a trace. I told myself for years it was a bear or an elk, like the other hunter had said. Or my imagination combining shadows into something that wasn't there. But I know what I saw. When your eyes meet something like that, something that shouldn't exist, you know. The way its chest expanded with each breath, the way its hand engulfed that tree trunk, the dome of its skull taking up nearly a quarter of my scope's field of view, the glimpse of teeth I caught when it parted its lips slightly, above all, those eyes, inhuman, yet terribly aware. My son is the only one I've told the full story to, and that was just last year after his mother passed. He asked me why I'd given up hunting so suddenly, why the man who taught him to love the outdoors had become so reluctant to venture beyond our backyard. If things like that are out there, I told him, I don't need to be out there too. He thinks it was grief talking, that I'm an old man with an overactive imagination or early dementia. Maybe he's right. Maybe 36 years of distance has warped my memory of that day. But I don't think so. I think about that other hunter we met running down the mountain. I wonder what he really saw. I wonder if he's spent the decades since then avoiding the woods too. Sometimes I dream I'm back in that clearing, rifle in hand, peering through my scope. But in the dreams, the creature isn't standing still. In the dreams, it's moving toward me, covering 75 yards in 3 impossible strides. In the dreams, I see what happens after our eyes meet. Those are the nights Helen used to wake me, telling me I was shouting in my sleep. I haven't been back to Mary's Creek Road since '72, haven't been hunting, camping, or hiking in the deep woods since that day. My friends ribbed me about it for years before giving up. My son thinks I'm a paranoid old man. My wife went to her grave never knowing why her outdoorsman husband suddenly became a homebody. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I wonder if it remembers seeing me too. They called this part of Idaho God's country for its beauty. But that day in October, I realized it wasn't just God's creatures living in those mountains. There was something else out there, something watching from the shadows, something that knew exactly what it was looking at when our eyes met through my rifle scope. I'm 71 years old now. I've had a good life, raised a family, built a business, but I've spent over half my life avoiding the wilderness I once loved because of 90 seconds on an autumn morning in '72, and I don't regret it for a minute. Story 6. I've gone back and forth about sharing this for almost 50 years now. I'm getting older, and I guess I've reached a point where I don't really care if people think I'm crazy anymore. What happened to me and my hunting buddy Frank back in '73 has haunted me all these years, and I need to get it off my chest. It was August 24th, 1973. I remember the date clearly because it was 3 days before my 31st birthday. Frank and I had planned this hunting trip in Valley County, Idaho for months. We were both experienced outdoorsmen, had been hunting these mountains since we were teenagers. This particular spot was a tributary of the South Fork of the Salmon River, a place we'd never explored before, but had heard was teeming with game. We arrived mid-afternoon after a bumpy drive up old logging roads in my Ford pickup. It was perfect. This small clearing right by the water where I could back my truck in, with thick brush behind us, and beyond that, this gorgeous meadow that opened up into a timbered basin. The whole area was ringed by these steep, rocky ridges that looked like they hadn't been touched by people in decades. Frank kept saying it was prime hunting ground. "Jimmy," he said, "we're going to fill our tags by tomorrow afternoon for sure." That's what everyone called me back then. Jimmy Wilson, though most folks call me James these days. We set up our site pretty quick. Nothing fancy, just our small 2-man tent and a folding table for the Coleman stove. Didn't even bother with a fire pit since it was August and plenty warm. We spent the rest of the daylight scouting the area, marking good spots on our topo map, and setting up a few trail markers so we wouldn't get lost in the dark if we needed to move around. The sun started to set around 8:30 or so. It was that perfect time in the mountains when the sky turns all purple and orange and everything gets real quiet. Frank and I were at the folding table, cooking up some T-bone steaks on the Coleman stove. We had a gas lantern hanging from a tree branch, casting this yellowish light around our little camp. We were drinking beer, talking about work, family stuff, normal conversation. I remember checking my watch. It was just about 9:15 when we heard it. A scream, but not like anything I'd ever heard in my 20 years of hunting those mountains. Not an elk, not a mountain lion, not a bear. It was this, God, even now it's hard to describe, this blood-curdling shriek that seemed to cut right through the night air. Then immediately after, there was this whistle, a clear, deliberate whistle that sounded almost human but wasn't quite right. I remember Frank and I just froze, forks halfway to our mouths, and looked at each other. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, another response came from higher up the ridge to our left. The same kind of whistle, but more distant, like they were communicating. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. My skin went cold, even though it was probably still 65 degrees out. Frank's face had gone white under the lantern light. "Get the rifles," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Frank nodded, and we both moved toward the truck where we'd stashed our gear. I had a Winchester Model 70 in 30-06, and Frank had his Remington 700. Good, powerful hunting rifles. As we were loading them, we heard thrashing in the thick brush right beyond our camp. Not small animals, but something big, multiple somethings, moving through the undergrowth with purpose, circling around us. And then the strangest thing happened. I can't explain it to this day. Frank and I both looked at each other at the exact same moment, and without saying a single word, we both just knew our rifles would be completely useless against whatever was out there. I don't mean we thought our calibers weren't big enough. I mean we both simultaneously felt this overwhelming certainty that guns were pointless, like trying to fight a hurricane with a feather, so we put the rifles back in the truck. I know how insane that sounds. Two grown men, experienced hunters, putting their weapons away when threatened by something unknown in the wilderness. But that's exactly what we did. We went back to the table and tried to act normal, like we weren't terrified. I remember my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my knife. The screams and whistles continued, getting closer, more frequent. The thrashing in the brush was so near now, we could hear branches snapping, leaves rustling, the heavy footfalls of something big. Multiple somethings big. "Let's move the stove," Frank whispered. We quickly grabbed the Coleman and our plates and moved around to the other side of the truck, putting the vehicle between us and the sounds. It felt like a flimsy barrier, but it was something. That's when all hell broke loose. The thrashing got louder, more deliberate. The whistles became more complex, patterns of short and long like some kind of code. And then we heard heavy breathing, not animal panting, but deep, controlled breathing, like someone trying to smell us. Frank was trembling beside me. I was too scared to even look at him. We both knew something had positioned itself on the other side of my truck and was watching us. I could feel its eyes on me, that cold, prickling sensation of being observed by something intelligent. "We need to leave," Frank whispered so quietly I barely heard him. "Now." We didn't even think about the food or the equipment. We just abandoned everything. The half-eaten steaks, the beer, even the Coleman stove still running. We scrambled into the truck cab, slammed the doors and locked them. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the key in the ignition. "Start the damn truck, Jimmy," Frank hissed, his eyes wild with fear. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, staring through the windshield into the darkness beyond the reach of our lantern light. Something was out there, just a few yards away, watching and waiting. We sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes, just shaking, listening to those whistles and occasional screams, hearing the creatures. I was certain now there were at least two of them, moving around our camp, investigating our things. Then I remembered something. I had a spotlight in the glove compartment, one of those powerful handheld ones that ran off the truck battery. Without telling Frank what I was doing, I slowly reached over and pulled it out. "What are you doing?" Frank whispered, grabbing my arm. "Don't!" But I had to know. I had to see what was out there. Nearly 50 years later, I still don't know if that was courage or the dumbest decision of my life. I flipped on the spotlight and aimed it through the driver's side window. What I saw in that brief moment of illumination has stayed burned into my memory for the rest of my life. It was standing about 20 feet away from my truck, partially obscured by a pine tree. Dark brown, almost black fur covering its entire body. Massive, I'd guess 7 or 8 feet tall at least. It was standing on 2 legs, but with a slight forward slump to its posture. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Arms too long, shoulders too broad, head seemingly attached directly to those shoulders without much of a neck. When my spotlight hit it, the creature's reaction was instantaneous. It whirled away from the light, but not before I caught a glimpse of its face. A flat, wide nose, deep-set eyes that reflected the light like a deer's, but intelligent. Human-like, but not human. Definitely not human. What happened next defies explanation. This creature, this thing, took off toward the steep rock slide that led up to one of the ridges. It was boulder hopping on 2 legs, moving faster than any human could possibly move over that kind of terrain. The agility was incredible, leaping from rock to rock, navigating the near vertical slope with the ease of a mountain goat, but on 2 legs. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Frank, my voice cracking. "Did you fucking see that?" Frank was pressed against the passenger door, as far away from the window as he could get. He was hyperventilating, his eyes squeezed shut. "Start the truck," was all he said. This time, my hands cooperated. I got the key in, started the engine, and flipped on the headlights. The camp was a mess, our table overturned, supplies scattered everywhere. I put the truck in reverse and backed out of there as fast as I dared on the narrow forest road. We drove straight through the night, not stopping for anything, not saying a word to each other until we hit the main highway near Cascade. We never went back for our equipment, never reported what happened to the Forest Service or the sheriff. Who would believe us? What would we even say? The strangest part of all this, and I've had almost 50 years to think about it, is that despite being the most terrifying experience of my life, I never felt like the creatures intended to harm us. They could have easily attacked if they wanted to. They were curious, territorial maybe, but not aggressive. After the initial fear wore off, I've actually felt this weird desire to go back, to see them again, to understand what they were. Frank never went hunting again after that night. Sold all his gear, moved to Arizona a few months later. We lost touch over the years. Last I heard, he'd had a heart attack in the 90s. I tried calling him a couple times before that, but he would hang up if I mentioned anything about Idaho or that night. I did go back to Valley County about 10 years later, in '83. Drove up as close as I dared to that same area, but couldn't bring myself to go all the way to our old campsite. I sat in my truck at a turnout about a mile away, just listening to the forest. I heard nothing unusual that day. That basin, though, it makes perfect sense as habitat. Lush grass in the meadow for deer and elk, which means food. Dark timber for cover. The stream for water. And those rocky ridges probably had caves or old mining tunnels for shelter. It was remote, seldom visited by humans. Perfect. I'm 79 now, and I've never told this story publicly before. My children and grandchildren think I'm just a regular old man who used to hunt and fish a lot. My wife knew something happened on that trip. I had nightmares for years afterwards, but even she doesn't know the full story. I still don't know what to call what we saw that night. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, those names seem almost silly compared to the reality of what was out there. All I know is that it was intelligent, it was powerful, and it changed how I understand the world. To this day, whenever I hear a strange sound at night or catch movement in the trees from the corner of my eye, I wonder if they're watching me. And part of me, a part I don't fully understand, hopes they are. Story 7. I've never been much for sharing personal stuff online, but after keeping this bottled up for so long, I need to get it off my chest. What happened to me back in the summer of '78 has haunted me for over 40 years now. I've only told a handful of people, my family mostly, and they all think I'm either crazy or that I imagined the whole thing. It's become this running joke at family gatherings like, "Hey, remember when Dan saw Bigfoot?" followed by everyone laughing. But I know what I saw that day. It was late July in Sedgwick County, Kansas. One of those scorching summer days where the heat just radiates off everything and makes the air shimmer. I was 23 at the time, working at the local feed store, but I'd taken the day off to go fishing with my buddy Mark. Kansas summers can be brutal, but being by the water was always the best way to beat the heat, and honestly, there wasn't much else to do around there for fun. We drove out to this spot on the Arkansas River I'd been fishing since I was a kid. It was about 40 minutes from town on these winding back roads, pretty secluded, which is why I liked it. No crowds, just peace and quiet. We brought Mark's Great Dane, Zeus, along with us. That dog was massive, almost came up to my waist, and I'm not a short guy at 6'1". Mark always joked that Zeus was the closest thing to a bear you'd find in Kansas. We got to the river around 11 in the morning. The water was low that summer because of the drought, but there was still enough flow to make it good for fishing. I remember the smell of the river, that muddy, earthy scent mixed with the sweet smell of cottonwood trees. Grasshoppers were chirping like crazy in the fields behind us, and you could hear the occasional splash of a fish jumping somewhere downstream. We'd been fishing for maybe 2 hours, and I'd caught a couple of decent catfish. Nothing spectacular, but enough to make it worthwhile. Mark was getting restless like he always did. Guy could never sit still for more than an hour. Said he wanted to try his luck a bit downstream where the river bent around this little peninsula. He took Zeus with him, since the dog was getting antsy too, splashing around and probably scaring away half the fish. "I'll be back in an hour or so," Mark called out as he started trudging down the riverbank. "Don't scare all the fish away," I shouted back. I was left alone, standing knee-deep in the warm river water. The current wasn't strong, just enough to feel it pushing against my legs. I was wearing these old cut-off jeans and a faded Kansas City Royals t-shirt that was sticking to my back from the sweat. My fishing hat, this beaten-up thing my dad had given me years back, was the only thing keeping the sun from frying my face completely. I cast my line again, watching it arc through the air before the lure plopped into the water about 30 feet out. The river was maybe 60 feet wide at that point, with trees lining both sides. I remember feeling totally at peace, just me and the water and the rhythmic motion of slowly reeling in my line. Every now and then, I'd sip from my beer, which was somehow still cold in the little cooler I'd brought. That's when I first felt it. This weird sensation, like when you realize someone's watching you. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I got this heavy feeling in my gut. At first, I tried to ignore it. I've spent enough time in the woods to know your mind can play tricks on you when you're alone. But then I heard it, this deep, heavy breathing coming from behind me on the western bank. It wasn't loud, but it was substantial. That's the only way I can describe it. It had weight to it, like when a big animal breathes. My first thought was that Zeus had come back and was panting from running around. That dog was always huffing and puffing after chasing squirrels or whatever else caught his attention. So I turned around, actually expecting to see that goofy Great Dane staring back at me. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. About 200 feet away, standing beside a massive cottonwood tree on the western bank, was something. Something tall, something that shouldn't exist in Kansas or anywhere really. It was just standing there, watching me. The thing was at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It had this athletic build, not bulky like a gorilla, but not thin either. More like a really jacked, really tall human, except it wasn't human. It was covered in hair, dark brown or black, hard to tell in the shadows of the trees. The hair wasn't super long and matted like you see in those cheesy Bigfoot shows. It was more like a short, dense coat that covered its entire body, including its face. But its eyes, God, its eyes, they were so human-looking it made my skin crawl, dark, intelligent, and fixed directly on me. There was awareness there. Not just animal curiosity, but something deeper. Something that understood what it was looking at. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a few minutes, we just stared at each other. Me, frozen in place with my fishing pole hanging limply from my hand, and this creature, watching me with what seemed like equal parts caution and curiosity. I couldn't move. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they were cemented to the riverbed. I remember thinking, this isn't happening. This can't be real. But it was real. As real as the cold sweat breaking out across my forehead and the hammering of my heart against my ribs. The longer we stared at each other, the more nervous I got. I wasn't armed, didn't even have a pocket knife on me, just standing there in knee-deep water with nothing between me and whatever this thing was except about 200 feet of open space. Finally, the paralysis broke. I dropped my fishing pole, just let it fall right into the water, didn't even think about it. I started moving sideways, downstream toward where Mark had gone. I didn't take my eyes off the creature, and I moved slowly at first, not wanting to trigger some kind of predatory response. That's when it did something that still gives me chills when I think about it. As I moved, it quickly shifted positions, moving to the next tree northward. It was fast, way faster than something that size should be able to move. Not running exactly, but this quick, fluid motion from one tree to the next. And it kept staring at me, never breaking eye contact. A crazy thought popped into my head. My brother Jeff was always playing pranks on me. Could this be him in some kind of costume? It didn't seem possible. The thing was too tall, too natural in its movements. But I was desperate for a rational explanation. "Jeff!" I called out, my voice cracking embarrassingly. "Jeff! If that's you, this isn't funny, man!" The creature didn't react at all. No change in posture, no recognition at the name. Just that same intense stare. I picked up my pace, moving faster through the water. It wasn't deep, but the rocky bottom made it hard to move quickly without slipping. And each time I moved a few yards, the creature would move to the next tree, keeping pace with me, always watching. By this point, I was practically jogging through the water, splashing everywhere, not caring about stealth anymore. I just wanted to reach Mark and his giant dog and not be alone with this thing anymore. After what felt like an hour but was probably only a few minutes, I finally spotted Mark downstream. He was sitting on a fallen log, Zeus lying beside him. "Mark!" I shouted, my voice unnaturally high. "Mark!" He looked up, confused at first, then concerned when he saw the state I was in. "Dude, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I was panting, pointing back up the river. "There's something up there, by the trees. Something big." Mark stood up, Zeus immediately alert beside him. "What do you mean, something? A bear?" He laughed. "There aren't any bears around here, Dan." "Not a bear," I said, still trying to catch my breath. "It's tall, standing on 2 legs, watching me. It's been following me down the river." Mark's smile faded when he realized I wasn't joking. He grabbed the fishing knife he always carried and started walking back upriver with me. Zeus trotted ahead of us, tail high and ears perked up. "Show me," Mark said. We walked back to where I'd been fishing. My pole was still in the water, the line tangled around a submerged branch. But the western bank was empty. No tall figure, no watching eyes, nothing. "It was right there," I insisted, pointing to the trees. right by that big cottonwood. Then it moved to that one and that one. I pointed to each tree in succession. Mark looked skeptical but humored me. We crossed the river at a shallow point and walked to where I'd seen the creature. The ground was dry and sandy with patches of hard-packed dirt. We looked for footprints but found nothing unusual, just some deer tracks and the small imprints of raccoons or possums. "Are you sure you didn't just see a deer standing on its hind legs?" Mark asked, clearly not believing me. "Or maybe the heat got to you. You've been out in the sun for hours." "I know what I saw," I said firmly. "It wasn't a deer. It wasn't the heat. It was watching me, Mark. It understood what it was seeing." Zeus was sniffing around the base of the trees, but he wasn't acting alarmed or even particularly interested. If there had been something there recently, wouldn't a dog have picked up on it? We stayed for another hour, more out of stubbornness on my part than anything else. I wanted vindication, some proof that I wasn't losing my mind, but we found nothing. No hair, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest that anything unusual had been there. The drive back to town was quiet. Mark tried to make conversation, but I was too wrapped up in replaying what I'd seen. I knew he thought I was either playing a prank or had imagined the whole thing. When I got home that evening, the first thing I did was check if Jeff was around. He was sitting in the living room watching TV, had been home all day, according to my mom. That confirmed it wasn't him in a costume, not that I really thought it could have been. Whatever I saw was too tall, too natural to be a person in a suit. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes staring back at me. Human eyes in a face that wasn't human. The intelligence behind them, the awareness. The next day, I went to the local library and started researching. This was before the internet, so I was flipping through books and old newspaper articles. I found a few reports of wild man sightings in Kansas dating back to the late 1800s, but nothing recent, nothing specific to our county. Over the next few weeks, I went back to that fishing spot several times, always with someone else, always armed with at least a knife. I never saw the creature again. Part of me was relieved, but another part was almost disappointed. Like I'd been given a glimpse of something extraordinary, something most people would never see in their lifetime, and now it was gone. I told my family what happened, and that's when the family joke started. My dad laughed it off as a tall tale. My mom suggested maybe I'd dozed off and had a vivid dream. My brother kept making Bigfoot jokes, stomping around the house, making ridiculous hooting noises. Only my grandpa seemed to take me seriously. He pulled me aside one night and told me about something similar he'd seen back in the 40s while hunting in Missouri. Said he never told anyone because he knew they wouldn't believe him. Over the years, I've thought about that day thousands of times. I've questioned my own memory, wondered if maybe I did imagine it, or if the heat really did get to me. But deep down, I know what I saw. It was real. It was there, and it was watching me with an intelligence that was undeniably familiar. The thing that stuck with me the most, the detail I keep coming back to, is that if I'd had a gun that day, I don't think I could have shot it. Even in my fear, even with my heart pounding and adrenaline surging, there was something too human about it. Not in its appearance, it was definitely not a person, but in its essence, the way it watched me, the way it moved, the curiosity rather than aggression. To this day, I still go fishing. I still spend time in the woods, but I'm always aware now, always listening for that deep, heavy breathing, always glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those eyes watching me from the tree line. And sometimes, on very quiet nights when I'm alone with my thoughts, I wonder if it remembers me too. If somewhere out there, in the wild places where people rarely go, it sometimes thinks about the human. It watched fishing in the river on that hot summer day in '78. Story 8. I still remember that day in July of 1980 like it was yesterday. I was 16, and summer vacations stretched out endlessly before me. My best friend Kenny Martinez and I were camping at Milford Lake with our families, something we'd done for years. But this time was different. This time we brought our dirt bikes. We didn't have driver's licenses yet, but out there in the countryside, nobody really cared if a couple of teenagers rode motorcycles on the back roads. Kenny's dad had hauled our bikes in his truck, warning us to stick to the designated off-road areas. But of course, we had other plans. It was late afternoon, maybe around 6 or so. We'd spent most of the day riding around the official trails, but as the sun started its descent, Kenny got that look in his eye. You know the one. That let's push it a little further look that only teenage boys seem to master. "Let's check out that road that runs along the shore," he said, nodding toward a dirt path that disappeared into the distance. I hesitated, but not for long. "Lead the way," I replied, revving my engine. The day was perfect, warm, but not too hot, with just enough breeze to keep the bugs away. The dirt road was empty of traffic, running roughly parallel to the lakeshore. Milford Lake was about 100 yards to our left, with thick brush covering the area between the road and water. On our right stretched a hayfield with large round bales scattered throughout. We were completely alone, just the way we liked it. We'd been riding for maybe 20 minutes, pushing our bikes harder than we should have, showing off for nobody but ourselves. The road started climbing gradually, and we found ourselves approaching the crest of a pretty sizable hill. I was slightly ahead of Kenny, and as I reached the top, I instinctively hit my brakes. Something didn't feel right. I heard Kenny's bike skid to a halt beside me, and when I glanced over at him, his face had gone completely white. That's when I realized I wasn't imagining things. There at the bottom of the hill, next to this massive oak tree, was something, someone, a figure. It was about 75 yards away, standing motionless, staring up at us. The sun was setting behind it, so all I could see was this dark silhouette against the golden light. But even as just a shadow, I knew immediately this wasn't a person, at least not any person I'd ever seen. Kenny and I exchanged this shocked look like, "Are you seeing this too?" When we both turned back to look, it was gone, just vanished. Either it had moved into the trees near the lake or was hiding among those hay bales. Either way, it had moved fast. Too fast. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Did you?" I started, but couldn't finish. "Yeah," Kenny whispered. "I saw it." We sat there, frozen on our bikes for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. Part of me wanted to turn around and race back to camp as fast as possible. Another part, the stupid 16-year-old boy part, wanted to go down there and investigate. "We should check it out," Kenny finally said, though his voice shook slightly. "Are you crazy?" I hissed. "We came all this way," he argued, but I could tell he was trying to convince himself as much as me. After another moment of hesitation, we slowly started rolling down the hill, engines barely above idle. Every inch closer made my stomach twist tighter. When we reached the tree where the figure had been standing, we stopped again. There was nothing there. No footprints that I could see in the hard-packed dirt. No broken branches, nothing. "Maybe it was just a person," I suggested, desperately wanting it to be true. "Some guy out for a walk." Kenny shook his head. "Did you see how big it was? That wasn't a person, Jason." The sun was getting low now, casting long shadows across the landscape. Neither of us wanted to be out there after dark. "We should head back," I said, and Kenny nodded immediately. We rode back to camp in silence, much slower than we'd come. Every shadow in the brush made me flinch, and I kept expecting to see that figure again, watching us from the trees or from behind a hay bale. When we got back to camp, we burst into the common area where our families were preparing dinner. We were talking over each other, trying to explain what we'd seen. My mom looked concerned at first, probably thinking we'd crashed our bikes, but as our story unfolded, the adults exchanged those looks parents give each other when they think their kids are making stuff up. "It was huge," Kenny was saying, "like way bigger than a person." "It was standing there watching us," I added. "And then it just disappeared." My dad chuckled. "Sounds like you boys have quite the imagination." "We're not making this up," I protested. Kenny's dad patted his shoulder. "Sure, son, now go wash up for dinner." Nobody believed us. Not our parents, not Kenny's older sister, who rolled her eyes dramatically, not even my younger brother, who usually ate up any scary story I told him. They all thought we were just two kids spinning tales for attention. Later that night, Kenny snuck over to my family's campsite. We sat by the dying embers of our campfire, whispering so we wouldn't wake anyone. "I know what I saw," he insisted. "Me too," I agreed. If I'd been alone, I might have thought I was seeing things, but we both saw it. We tried to describe it to each other, comparing what we'd observed. The figure had a massive, broad body with practically no neck. Its head seemed disproportionately large. The whole silhouette was very dark, even accounting for the backlighting from the sun. "Do you think it was a bear?" I asked, though I knew it wasn't. Bears don't stand like that. Kenny shook his head. It was standing on two legs, perfectly straight, looking right at us. We both fell silent, listening to the night sounds around us. Crickets chirping, the occasional splash from the lake, distant laughter from another campsite. Everything seemed so normal, which made what we'd seen feel even more surreal. For the rest of that camping trip, we stuck close to the official campgrounds. No more ventures down lonely dirt roads, no more exploring. Our parents thought we'd gotten spooked by a deer or something and teased us mercilessly, but they didn't see what we saw. 2 weeks later, before the summer ended, we got up the courage to go back. I'm not sure why we did it. To prove to ourselves we weren't crazy, I guess. This time, we went in broad daylight, around noon, when the sun was high overhead and shadows were at their minimum. We rode our bikes to the same spot, crested that same hill, and stopped. The place looked totally different in the bright sunlight, less mysterious, less threatening. We rode down to the tree and discovered that recent rain had washed away any potential tracks or evidence. But Kenny had an idea. "Stand by the tree," he told me. "I'm going to go up to where we were on the hill, and we'll see how tall a normal person looks from there." I did as he asked, standing with my back against the tree trunk while Kenny rode back up the hill. When he got there, he waved at me to indicate he was looking. Then he rode back down. "Now it's my turn," he said. Kenny was about 5'7" at the time. When I got to the top of the hill and looked down, I could see him standing where we believed the figure had been. I tried to picture the silhouette we'd seen superimposed over Kenny. When I rejoined him at the tree, we compared notes. "Your head reached about here," I told Kenny, pointing to a spot on the tree trunk. He nodded slowly. "There's a branch right above that point." He reached up, straining to touch it. "That's about 2.5 feet above my head." We did the math. If Kenny was 5'7", and the creature's head reached a branch 2.5 feet higher than his, that put it at over 7 feet tall. And it wasn't just the height. It was the breadth, the massive shoulders, the strange proportions. "You think anyone would believe us now?" Kenny asked. I shook my head. "Probably not." We didn't talk much about it after that summer. School started back up, life moved on, and the incident got filed away in that mental drawer labeled "weird stuff that happened once." But I never forgot it. How could I? Kenny moved away the following year when his dad got transferred to California. We promised to stay in touch, but you know how it goes. Letters became less frequent, then stopped altogether. This was long before cell phones and social media made keeping in touch easy. Fast forward to 2005. I was scrolling through my emails when one caught my eye, from Kenny Martinez. He'd tracked me down through an alumni website for our high school. We exchanged a few messages, catching up on the last 25 years of our lives. And then, in one email, he wrote, "Do you ever think about what we saw that day at Milford Lake?" I stared at those words for a long time before responding. "All the time," I wrote back. We arranged to meet when he came back to Kansas to visit family that Christmas. Sitting in a diner in our hometown, both of us middle-aged men with families and responsibilities, we finally talked about it again. "I've done some research," Kenny told me, keeping his voice low, though the diner was nearly empty. "There have been other sightings in that area. Not many, but enough to make me think we weren't crazy." "What do you think it was?" I asked, though I already knew his answer. "Bigfoot," he said simply. "Sasquatch. Whatever you want to call it. That's what we saw, Jason." I nodded slowly. "I've thought the same thing for years, but never told anyone." "Me neither," he admitted. "Who would believe it?" We spent hours talking, remembering details that had faded over time, the way it held itself, so still and yet somehow alert, how quickly it had vanished, the strange, prickling feeling of being watched that had overcome both of us at the exact same moment. I've never gone back to that specific spot at Milford Lake. Sometimes I think about taking my own kids camping there, but something always stops me. It's not fear exactly. Whatever we saw that day didn't try to harm us. It's more like respect. That place belongs to something else, something that was there long before us and will likely be there long after. I don't expect people to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I question it myself. But then I remember Kenny's face when we both stopped our bikes at the top of that hill. I remember the absolute certainty we both felt in that moment. We saw something that day in the summer of 1980 that wasn't supposed to exist. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there, standing by that tree, watching and waiting for someone else to crest that hill. Story 9. I still get goosebumps thinking about that summer in '81. I was 13, and man, the world seemed so much simpler then. No cell phones, no internet, just endless summer days to kill with whatever adventures we could dream up. That particular day changed how I look at the world, though. It's been over 40 years, and I've never told many people about what happened. Most wouldn't believe me anyway. It was late July in Crawford County, Kansas. The kind of summer heat that makes the air shimmer above the asphalt, and your t-shirt stick to your back within minutes of stepping outside. I was staying at my Aunt Margie's place for 2 weeks, like I did most summers. Her house sat on this little plot of land that backed up to what we called the strip pits, these weird man-made hills left over from all the coal mining they did decades before. My cousin Darren was 16 that summer, and he had his 7-year-old nephew Mikey staying with them too. Darren's sister had dropped him off for the week while she worked some extra shifts. Mikey was this scrawny kid with a bowl cut and endless energy, always wanting to tag along with us older boys. That morning after breakfast, Darren suggested we head out to the slag heaps to catch frogs. These weren't just little bumps in the landscape. Some of these hills rose up 20, maybe 25 feet high. Between them, rainwater would collect in these shallow pools that became perfect little habitats for all kinds of critters, especially frogs and tadpoles. Mikey nearly knocked over his cereal bowl with excitement when we mentioned it. "You gotta wear your boots," Aunt Margie warned us as we headed out the door. "Those slag heaps will cut you to ribbons." She wasn't exaggerating. Those hills weren't made of dirt or normal rock. They were these weird piles of clay mixed with broken shale, and that shale formed these sharp spines that stuck out everywhere. Earlier that summer, I'd slipped while climbing one and sliced my calf open on a particularly nasty piece. 7 stitches and a tetanus shot later, I'd learned my lesson about proper footwear. We set out around 10 in the morning, each carrying a small bucket for our amphibian treasures, plus some peanut butter sandwiches and canteens of water. The strip pit started about a mile behind my aunt's property. It was an odd landscape, almost alien compared to the flat farmland that dominated most of the county. The slag heaps created this rolling miniature mountain range of gray-black mounds. Nothing much grew on the heaps themselves, but the areas between them had become overgrown with scrubby trees, tall grass, and cattails around the pools. "I bet I can catch more frogs than you guys combined," Mikey challenged, already running ahead. "Slow down," Darren called after him. "You don't know which pools are deep." We spent the morning working our way deeper into the strip pits than I'd ever gone before. Most locals used the area for hunting or fishing in the bigger ponds, but there were sections that probably hadn't seen human footprints in years. It felt like exploring another planet. The landscape was just so different from anywhere else in Kansas. It must have been around 1 in the afternoon when we stumbled upon a part of the strip pits I'd never seen before. The slag heaps formed a sort of natural bowl with a decent-sized pool in the middle, maybe 15 feet across. The water was surprisingly clear, and you could see tadpoles darting around. "Jackpot!" Darren shouted, already rolling up his jeans to wade in from one side. I circled around to the other side where the bank looked less muddy. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. In the soft mud at the edge of the pond was a single footprint. But not just any footprint. This thing was enormous. I stood there frozen, staring down at it, trying to process what I was seeing. "Guys," I called out, my voice coming out higher than I intended. "You need to see this." Darren must have heard something in my tone because he stopped splashing around immediately. He and Mikey trudged over to where I stood. "Holy shit," Darren whispered when he saw it. Even little Mikey was speechless, and that kid never shut up. The footprint was pressed deep into the mud, like whatever made it was heavy. It was huge. I'd guess 18 inches long at least, and maybe 7 inches across at the widest part. 5 clear toe impressions were visible at the front. The shape was unmistakably a foot, not a bear paw or anything else I could explain away. What struck me most was how casual it seemed. There was just the one print, like whatever left it had been strolling by and just happened to step 1 foot into the softer ground near the water's edge. I looked around for other tracks, but the surrounding area was all hard-packed clay and sharp shale, nothing that would hold a print. "Is that?" Mikey started to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a footprint," Darren said, squatting down next to it. "It's too big to be a person," I added. My heart was hammering in my chest. We all knew what we were thinking, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. Growing up in rural Kansas, we'd all heard the stories. Old-timers at the general store talking about strange howls in the night. Hunters claiming to have seen something big moving through the trees that walked on 2 legs, but definitely wasn't human. "Bigfoot," Mikey finally whispered, saying what we were all thinking. Darren tried to laugh it off, but it came out forced. "Come on, there's no such thing." But I could see he was rattled too. He kept looking around nervously, scanning the tops of the slag heaps that surrounded us. I squatted down to examine the print more closely. The impression was crisp. The toes, the arch, the heel, all perfectly defined in the mud. It couldn't have been more than a day old, maybe less. What struck me was how flat the foot was. It didn't have the high arch most humans have, and there was something about the toe pattern that just seemed different. But the most chilling realization was the terrain. I looked down at my own boots, caked with dust from the sharp shale we'd been walking on all morning. No human could walk barefoot through this landscape. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. The shale would slice open unprotected skin in seconds. Whatever left this print either had feet tough as tire rubber or didn't care about the pain. "We should leave," I said quietly, standing up. "But we just got here," Mikey protested, though his earlier enthusiasm had evaporated. Tyler's right, Darren said, surprising me with his agreement. Let's head back. As we gathered our things, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. The slag heaps that had seemed like a playground earlier now felt ominous, like they could be hiding something just over the next ridge. The silence struck me too. The bird calls and insect buzzing that had provided background noise all morning had gone quiet. We started back the way we came, but nothing looked familiar. Usually I had a good sense of direction, but the slag heaps all looked the same after a while. Identical mounds of grey-black waste rock stretching in every direction. Didn't we come from that way? Darren pointed to our left. I thought it was more that way, I said, gesturing straight ahead. We picked a direction and walked. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, and our earlier excitement had been replaced with a nervous tension. Nobody wanted to admit we were lost, but after 20 minutes of walking, we hadn't found any landmarks we recognized. My feet hurt, Mikey complained. Just a bit further, Darren assured him, though I could tell by his furrowed brow that he had no idea where we were going. That's when we heard it, a sound I still can't adequately describe 40 years later. It was like a mix between a deep rumbling growl and a whooping call. It echoed across the slag heaps, making it impossible to tell which direction it came from. But one thing was certain. It was loud. Whatever made that sound had serious lungs. Mikey grabbed my hand, his small fingers digging into my palm. "What was that?" he whispered. "Probably just some weird bird," Darren said, but his face had gone pale. Then came the second sound, rocks sliding and tumbling down one of the slag heaps to our right. We all whipped our heads around in time to see a small avalanche of shale skittering down the steep side of a particularly tall heap about 50 yards away. "Something's up there," I whispered. The three of us stood frozen, staring at the spot where the rocks had fallen. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, something rose up at the top of the heap. At first, I could only make out a dark shape against the bright sky, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was looking at a head and upper shoulders peering down at us from the ridgeline. Even from that distance, I could tell it was massive, far larger than any man I'd ever seen. The head seemed directly connected to the shoulders, with little or no neck visible. "Run!" Darren suddenly shouted, shoving Mikey ahead of him. We took off, scrambling across the uneven ground. I could hear Mikey crying as we ran, but fear drove us forward. Behind us came a crashing sound, like something large was descending the slag heap in pursuit. "This way!" I yelled, spotting a dense patch of scrubby trees between two smaller heaps. We dove into the underbrush, thorns tearing at our clothes and skin. But we didn't stop. The sound of heavy footsteps grew louder. Not the rapid footfalls of someone running, but slow, deliberate steps that covered ground quickly. Whatever was following us wasn't in a hurry. It knew the territory better than we did. It knew we had nowhere to go. We burst out of the thicket into a clearing I recognized. We'd passed it on our way in. For the first time, I had a sense of which direction would lead us home. "This way!" I gasped, pointing. "If we follow this line of heaps, we'll get back to the edge of my aunt's property." We ran until our lungs burned. The sound of those heavy footsteps always just behind us, but never quite catching up. It was like it was herding us, making sure we were heading out of its territory. When we finally reached the edge of the strip pits and could see my aunt's house in the distance across the field, the footsteps behind us stopped. I chanced to look back, but saw nothing except the eerie landscape of slag heaps we'd just fled. We didn't stop running until we burst through my aunt's back door, startling her so badly she dropped a plate on the kitchen floor. "Good Lord, what happened to you three?" she exclaimed, taking in our scratched faces, torn clothes, and wild eyes. Darren and I exchanged glances. "We got lost," I said finally, then thought we saw a bear. It was easier than telling the truth. What would we even say? That we'd found a giant humanoid footprint and been chased by a creature that wasn't supposed to exist. Later that evening, after Mikey had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from our ordeal, Darren and I sat on the back porch steps. "You know what we saw, right?" I asked quietly. Darren was silent for a long time before answering. "I don't know what we saw, but that footprint, that was real. You think anybody would believe us if we told them?" He snorted. "In Crawford County, we'd never hear the end of it." We made a pact that night not to tell anyone. Even today, over 40 years later, only a handful of people have heard this story. Most probably think I'm making it up, or that it's just a distorted childhood memory. But I know what I saw. The wildlife officers had relocated black bears to the region around that time, and there were always rumors of mountain lion sightings. Someone even claimed to have spotted a large black cat, like a panther, moving along one of the tree roads. But none of those explanations fit what we encountered. I've spent years thinking about that footprint in the mud, 18 inches long, 7 inches wide, 5 distinct toes, in terrain where no human would ever go barefoot. I've thought about that massive silhouette watching us from the ridgeline and those slow, deliberate footsteps that followed us out. I've never been back to those specific slag heaps, though I've driven past the area many times as an adult. Sometimes, when I'm on the highway that runs near there, I find myself scanning the strange, rolling landscape of those strip pits. And sometimes, just for a moment, I think I see something large moving between the hills, something that doesn't quite belong. Maybe that's why I'm finally sharing this story now. Not for attention or to convince anyone, but because I've carried this memory for 40 years, and sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen what we saw in Crawford County that summer. If anyone else has heard those strange, whooping calls echoing across the strip pits. If anyone else has found an 18-inch footprint pressed into the mud in a place where no human would ever walk barefoot. Story 10. I still can't believe what happened that night back in August of 1984. I've kept this story mostly to myself because who the hell would believe me? But after seeing more reports online from the same area, I figured it's time to share what I saw. Maybe someone out there has seen the same thing. It was a hot Kansas night, you know the kind. When the air is so thick with humidity, you feel like you're breathing through a wet towel. Me, my buddy Rick, and his cousin Jake decided to try our luck with some night fishing. We'd heard about this small lake in Osage County that was supposed to be full of catfish, and Rick knew a back route to get there. I was 22 at the time, fresh out of college, working at my uncle's auto shop while I figured out what to do with my life. Fishing was a cheap way to kill time, and we'd go whenever we could get a six-pack and some bait. We left around 10:30 that evening in my beat-up Chevy pickup. The whole way there, Rick kept talking about how his dad's friend caught a 15-pound catfish at this spot last summer. I was only half listening, more focused on navigating the increasingly narrow country roads. Jake was sprawled out in the small back seat of my extended cab, already halfway through his second beer. The full moon was out that night, I remember, because we joked about not needing our flashlights. It cast this eerie silver light across the fields and made the shadows between trees look like black holes. After about 40 minutes of driving, we turned onto this dirt road that ran alongside what Rick swore was the lake, though in the darkness it just looked like a big shadow beyond the trees. "Slow down, man," Rick said, leaning forward in his seat. "There should be a spot to park somewhere around here." I eased off the gas, crawling along that dirt road at maybe 5 miles an hour, dust kicking up behind us. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of tall grass and the occasional scrubby tree. My windows were down, and I could hear crickets and frogs making a racket. The smell of still water and wet earth filled the truck. "There," Rick pointed. "Pull over by that clearing." I was about to turn toward where he was pointing when something caught my eye, something that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just a dead tree, or maybe some farming equipment somebody had left out. But as I slowed the truck even more, the headlights swept across it, and I realized it was standing in the grass next to a small tree, about 20 or 30 yards from the water's edge. "Hold up," I said, my voice coming out weirdly tight. "You guys see that?" Rick leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. "See what?" I killed the engine, but left the headlights on. The figure was just at the edge of their reach, partially lit up, partially in shadow. My heart started hammering against my ribs. "By that tree, look!" The three of us sat there, staring. The thing was shaped like a person, but all wrong. It was massive, way too tall to be a normal man, 7, maybe 8 feet at least, and broad, with these powerful-looking shoulders and a thick chest. But what really got me was the fur. Its entire body was covered in shaggy brown fur, almost the exact color of a deer's coat. "What the fuck is that?" Jake whispered from the back seat. The creature wasn't moving. It was just standing there, staring at us. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I could feel it watching. The moonlight caught parts of its fur, giving it this silvery edge that made it look almost unreal. "Turn the truck around," Rick said, his voice barely audible. "Now, Mike." I couldn't move. It sounds stupid now, but I felt like if I broke eye contact with this thing, something bad would happen, like it was holding me there with its stare. "It's just watching us," I said. My mouth had gone completely dry. "That's a fucking bear, man. Turn the goddamn truck around," Rick hissed, gripping the dashboard. "It's not a bear," I said. "Look at it. It's standing upright. Bears don't stand like that for that long." The silence in the truck was suffocating. I could hear each of our breaths, fast and shallow. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel. "I've got to get a better look," I said, reaching for the door handle. Rick grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. "Are you fucking insane? Don't get out of this truck!" I shook him off, but didn't open the door. Instead, I leaned closer to the windshield, trying to make out more details. The creature still hadn't moved an inch. It was like a statue, except for the fur that occasionally stirred in the light breeze. "It's a Bigfoot," Jake said from the back seat, his voice a mix of fear and awe. "Holy shit, it's actually a Bigfoot." "Shut up," Rick snapped. "That's not real." But I knew what I was looking at. Every detail was burning itself into my memory. The proportions were all wrong for a human, arms too long, hanging down almost to its knees. The head sat directly on those massive shoulders, no real neck to speak of, and its stance was powerful, like it could charge or leap at any moment. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. The only sound was our breathing and the distant chorus of frogs from the lake. Then Jake shifted in the back seat, the vinyl squeaking loudly as he leaned forward between Rick and me for a better look. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, an impossibly quick movement that sent ice down my spine. In that instant, I saw its eyes catch the headlights, reflecting back a deep amber color, like a cat's eyes in the dark. I don't remember consciously deciding to leave. My body just took over. I jammed the key in the ignition, cranked the engine to life, and hit the gas so hard we fishtailed on the dirt road. The tires spun, kicking up clouds of dust before finally catching traction. "Go, go, go!" Rick was yelling, though I was already flooring it. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the truck on the narrow road. We tore out of there doing 40 on a road meant for 15, bouncing over potholes and nearly clipping trees on the tight turns. None of us said a word for the first 10 minutes of the drive back. Then Rick broke the silence. "That wasn't real," he said, his voice still shaky. "Probably just some weirdo in a costume trying to scare people." "In the middle of nowhere? At midnight?" I shot back. "Who the hell would do that?" "I don't know, man, but it couldn't be a Bigfoot," Jake finished for him. "I swear to God that's what it was." "Both of you shut up," I said. "Whatever it was, we're not going back there tonight." But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way it just stood there, watching us. The impossible size of it. The way its eyes reflected in the light. No costume I'd ever seen could look that real. For the next day, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those eyes whenever I closed mine. Rick and Jake were equally freaked out, though Rick insisted it had to be a prank or we were seeing things. Jake was the only one who openly said he believed it was a Sasquatch. 2 days later, I went back, alone. I know, stupid move, but I had to know. In the daylight, everything looked different. The lake was smaller than it had seemed at night, surrounded by scrubby trees and tall grass. There were farm fields visible in the distance. It was just a normal, quiet spot in rural Kansas. I parked exactly where we'd stopped that night and got out, scanning the area. The tree was there, the one the creature had been standing next to. I walked over, my heart still racing even in broad daylight. The grass was trampled down in a rough circle about 3 feet wide, but there were no distinct footprints, just disturbed vegetation. Nothing conclusive. I spent about an hour searching the area, looking for fur, footprints, anything. Found nothing but some broken branches on a few trees about 7 feet up, higher than most people could reach without a ladder. On my way home, I stopped by my Uncle Frank's place. He's my mom's brother, lives just outside Topeka. I hadn't planned to tell anyone about what happened, but something made me bring it up while we were having a beer on his porch. "Hey, Uncle Frank," I said, trying to sound casual. "You ever hear any weird stories about that small lake out in Osage County? The one with all the catfish?" He took a long pull from his beer before answering. "Haskell Lake? Sure, fished there plenty of times. What kind of stories you mean?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Just wondering if anyone's seen anything strange out there." Uncle Frank gave me a long look. "This about that fishing trip the other night? You boys see something?" I hesitated, then nodded. He sighed and set his beer down. "Your cousins Tim and Bobby were out there night fishing about 6 years back. Summer of '78, I think. They came home white as sheets around 2 in the morning. Said they heard these screams from across the lake." My skin went cold despite the August heat. "Screams? Like what?" "They said it sounded like a wildcat at first, but bigger, much bigger. Said it was so damn loud it set off dogs barking in Carbondale. That's 3 miles from the lake." "Did they see anything?" I asked, my mouth dry again. Uncle Frank shook his head. "Nope, but they packed up their gear so fast they left half of it behind. Bobby went back the next day to get it and said he found these huge tracks in the mud by the shore. Said they looked like bare feet, but were nearly 16 inches long." We sat in silence for a minute. Then he asked, "So, what did you boys see out there, Mike?" I told him everything. The figure by the tree, the size of it, the fur, the eyes. How it just stood there watching us. Uncle Frank listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding. When I finished, he didn't laugh or tell me I was seeing things. He just took another drink of his beer and said, "Lot of empty space out in those counties. Lot of woods and fields where things could hide. People round here have been seeing things in them woods for generations." "You believe in Bigfoot, Uncle Frank?" I asked, almost laughing at how ridiculous the question sounded out loud. He shrugged. "Don't know what I believe, but I believe you saw something. And I believe Tim and Bobby heard something. And that's enough for me to know there's things out there we don't understand. That was almost 40 years ago now. I've never gone back to that lake, though I've heard it's privately owned these days. Rick eventually convinced himself we saw a bear or some other animal, something that made more sense to him. Jake moved to Colorado a few years later, and we lost touch. I've only told this story a handful of times over the years. Most people react like you'd expect. They laugh or they think I'm making it up. But sometimes I'll tell it to someone who gets real quiet, and then they'll say, "You know, I saw something once too." There's more of us out there than you'd think. People who've had encounters we can't explain. I don't have proof. I don't have pictures or footprint casts. All I have is what I saw that night in Osage County, Kansas, in August of 1984. a creature that shouldn't exist, standing by a tree in the moonlight, watching me as I watched it. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, hidden in the patches of wilderness that still exist between farms and highways. And sometimes, on quiet nights when I can't sleep, I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 11. I've never been the type to believe in monsters. Even as a kid, I hated scary movies because I knew they weren't real, and it seemed silly to be scared of something that didn't exist. That changed in the summer of '84. My husband, Rick, had been working second shift at Boeing for about 8 months by then. It was hard on all of us, especially our daughter, Amy, who was only 7 at the time. She missed her daddy reading her bedtime stories, but we'd adjusted to our routine. Since Rick wouldn't get home until after midnight, Amy and I would usually walk up to my father's house around sunset. Dad lived about a quarter mile up this little dirt road that connected to the main county road, not far from our place in rural Sedgwick County, Kansas. Those evening walks became our thing. We'd visit Dad for about 30 minutes, have some iced tea or lemonade on his porch, then head back before it got completely dark. Amy would tell her grandpa about what she learned in summer school that day, and Dad would give her a piece of candy from the jar he kept filled just for her visits. It was simple, but it gave us something to look forward to during those lonely summer evenings while Rick was at work. July 18th started like any other summer day in Kansas, hot and humid. The air was thick, and everything seemed to move in slow motion because of the heat. Amy had been especially wound up that day, probably because of all the sugar from the popsicles we'd had after lunch. I remember thinking we should skip our evening walk because of the mosquitoes, but Amy begged to go see Grandpa, so we went. Dad was in a particularly talkative mood that evening. He'd been working on his old truck and wanted to show Amy how the engine worked. Before I knew it, the sun had completely set. I glanced at my watch and realized it was almost 9:30. We'd stayed nearly 2 hours longer than usual. "We really need to get going, Dad," I said, gathering up our things. "It's getting late." Dad offered to drive us home, but it seemed silly to bother with the truck for such a short distance. Besides, the truck was partially dismantled in his garage. I'd walked that road 1,000 times. I knew every pothole, every dip. "We'll be fine," I assured him. "It's not far." As we stepped out onto Dad's porch, I immediately regretted not taking him up on his offer. The darkness was absolute. There wasn't a moon that night, and the thick canopy of trees that lined our dirt road blocked out the stars. I'd never realized how dark it could get out there without moonlight. Amy clutched my hand tightly as we made our way down Dad's driveway to the dirt road. I tried to seem calm for her sake, but the darkness made me uneasy. Our house was only about a 5-minute walk, but suddenly it felt much farther away. We'd only been walking for a minute or so when I first heard it. Footsteps that weren't ours, coming from the direction of the head road that ran parallel to our dirt path. They weren't fast steps. They were measured, deliberate, like someone trying to walk quietly but not quite managing it. With each step came the sound of leaves crushing and twigs snapping. I squeezed Amy's hand and slowed down, listening hard. The footsteps stopped too. "What's wrong, Mom?" Amy whispered. "Nothing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just thought I heard something." We continued walking, and so did the footsteps. They matched our pace exactly, staying parallel to us, but hidden by the thick trees that separated our dirt road from the head road. I stopped again. The footsteps stopped. That's when I knew we were being followed. My heart started pounding so hard, I was sure Amy could hear it. I strained my eyes trying to see through the darkness, but it was useless. The trees were too dense, the night too black. "Let's play a game," I said to Amy, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. "Let's see how fast we can get home." Instead of continuing down the dirt road, I led Amy across our neighbor's vacant lot. The Wilsons had moved out months ago, and no one had bought their property yet. The lot was overgrown, but it would cut at least 2 minutes off our walk home. As we veered off the road, the footsteps changed direction too. Whatever was following us knew exactly where we were and was keeping pace. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or maybe a coyote. We'd seen both plenty of times around our property. But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those. Deer don't follow people, and coyotes don't walk with such heavy, deliberate steps. By the time we reached the edge of our property, I was practically dragging Amy along. Our house sat back from the road about 100 feet, surrounded by a cluster of oak and maple trees. I'd always loved how private and secluded it felt. That night, I hated it. I scanned our surroundings as we rushed toward the house, but saw nothing moving in the darkness. No shape, no shadow, nothing to explain the footsteps that had followed us the entire way. When we reached our front yard, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We were home. We were safe. "Let's sit in the swing for a minute," Amy said, pointing to the porch swing Rick had hung from the big oak tree in our front yard the previous summer. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to get inside and lock the door, but I didn't want to scare Amy. And honestly, I felt silly for being so frightened. Now that we were in our own yard, with the porch light casting a dim glow over the swing, my fear seemed ridiculous. "Just for a minute," I agreed, and we sat down on the wooden swing. Amy was chatting about what Grandpa had shown her on his truck when it happened. A sound cut through the quiet summer night. A sound so terrifying it made my blood turn to ice in my veins. It was a growl, but not like any animal growl I'd ever heard before. It was deep and rumbling, starting low, then building to something that sounded almost like words but weren't. The sound was guttural, primeval, and so full of menace it made my skin crawl. It came from the direction of the trees at the edge of our property, maybe 50 feet away. Amy fell silent mid-sentence. Her little body went rigid beside me. "Mom," she whispered, "did you hear that?" Before I could answer, the growl came again, but from a different location. It was behind us now, closer to the house, as if whatever had made that sound had moved with impossible speed. I've lived in rural Kansas my whole life. I know what coyotes sound like, what bobcats sound like. Hell, I even know what an angry bull sounds like. This wasn't any of those. This was something else entirely. "Amy," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage, "I want you to get up very slowly. We're going to walk to the front door. Not run, just walk, okay?" She nodded, her face pale in the dim light. We stood up from the swing and I placed my body between Amy and the direction of the last growl. We walked slowly toward the house, each step feeling like it took an eternity. The growl came again, this time from our left, near the old shed. It was moving, circling us. When we reached the front door, my hands were shaking so badly I could hardly get the key in the lock. After what seemed like forever, the door swung open, and I pushed Amy inside. I followed, slamming the door shut behind us and turning the deadbolt. I ran through the house, locking every door, closing every curtain, checking every window. Amy sat on the living room couch, hugging her knees to her chest, watching me with wide, frightened eyes. "What was that, Mom?" she asked in a small voice. "I don't know, sweetie," I replied honestly, "but we're safe now." I wasn't sure if that was true, but I needed to believe it. I needed her to believe it. I picked up the phone and dialed the sheriff's office. Deputy Hanson answered. I'd known Jim Hanson since high school, which made what I was about to ask even more embarrassing. "Jim, it's Elizabeth Collins. I was wondering, has there been any report of an animal escaping from somewhere, maybe from a zoo or a circus passing through?" "An escaped animal?" he repeated, confusion evident in his voice. "No, nothing like that. Why do you ask?" I hesitated, suddenly aware of how crazy I was about to sound. We heard something strange outside our house. A growl, but not like any animal I've ever heard around here. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Probably just a coyote, Liz. They can sound pretty weird sometimes, especially if they've caught something. No, Jim, this wasn't a coyote, I insisted. It was bigger, louder, and it followed us home from Dad's place. Followed you? Now he sounded concerned, but not about an animal. His tone had changed to the one people use when they think you might be overreacting. Look, I almost said yes, but then what? What would I tell them? That I heard growling? That something followed us home, but I never saw it? No, that's okay, I said finally. I'm sure you're right. It was probably nothing. After I hung up, I sat down next to Amy and put my arm around her. We stayed like that for a long time, neither of us speaking, both listening intently for any sound from outside. Around 11, I heard something moving around the side of the house. Heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel path that led to our backyard. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps circled the entire house, slowly, deliberately, as if whatever it was wanted us to know it was there. Then came the sound of something scraping against the back door, like claws or nails dragging down the wood. Amy buried her face in my side, and I pulled her closer. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the scratching. We stayed on the couch all night. I didn't dare move to the bedroom. It was at the back of the house, too far from the front door if we needed to escape. Rick found us there when he got home just after midnight, Amy asleep in my lap, me still wide awake, staring at the door. He thought I was crazy when I told him what had happened. The next morning, in the bright sunlight, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing too, until I saw the back door. 5 long, deep gouges ran from top to bottom, splintering the wood in places. Rick tried to explain them away. Maybe a raccoon, maybe the door had been damaged before and we just hadn't noticed. But I knew, and Amy knew. For weeks afterward, I wouldn't let Amy out of the house after dark. We stopped our evening walks to Dad's. Even Rick started coming home on his lunch break to check on us, though he never said it was because of what happened. He just missed us, he said. I spent hours researching animals native to Kansas, trying to figure out what could have made that sound, what could have followed us, what could have left those marks on our door. Nothing fit. Nothing even came close. It wasn't until years later, when I happened across an article about Bigfoot sightings in the Midwest, that something clicked. The description of the sounds people reported hearing, that deep, guttural growl that seemed almost like speech but wasn't quite human, matched exactly what we'd heard that night. I've never told anyone this story except Rick. Who would believe it? Even now, almost 40 years later, my hands shake when I think about that night. About the footsteps that matched our pace exactly. About the growl that seemed to come from all around us. About the claw marks on our door. I don't know what followed us home that summer night in '84. I don't know why it chose us or why it never came back. All I know is that sometimes, when I'm driving on a country road at dusk, I can't help but check my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something large and dark keeping pace with my car, just out of clear sight, waiting for the right moment to let me know it's still there. Ah! Story 12. I've never been one to believe in the paranormal. At 70 years old, I've seen enough of this world to know most mysteries have logical explanations. That was my mindset in the winter of '84, that bitter cold winter in Johnson County that I'll never forget. It had been snowing for weeks, the kind of Kansas winter that makes you question why people settled here in the first place. Temperatures hovered around 0, sometimes dipping well below that. The snow had built up to about 8 inches and had been sitting there long enough to form a thick crust on top, the kind that crunches when you step on it, then holds your weight. I remember that evening so clearly, January 18th, I believe. I'd been at my sister Beth's house for dinner and came home around 9. My son Tommy, 16 at the time, was practically bouncing off the walls when I walked in. His friend Kevin was with him, both of them red-faced and talking over each other. "Mom! Mom! You have to come see this!" Tommy kept saying, pulling at my coat before I could even take it off. "See what?" I asked, exhausted from the day. All I wanted was to sit in my recliner with a cup of tea. "We found bear tracks," Kevin blurted out. "Huge ones." I remember sighing and giving them both a look. Tommy had been obsessed with outdoor tracking since he was little, always bringing home plaster casts of deer prints, raccoon tracks, anything he could find. But bear tracks? In Johnson County? We hadn't had bears here in decades, if ever. "Boys, there aren't any bears around here," I said, finally managing to hang up my coat. "And it's too cold to go back out tonight." "Mom, please," Tommy persisted. "These aren't normal tracks. They're massive and they're fresh. We just found them an hour ago." I figured they were pulling my leg. Teenagers, you know. I assumed they'd made the tracks themselves, stomping around in the snow to fool me. Tommy had done similar pranks before, but he wouldn't let up, and there was something in his eyes, a genuine excitement I hadn't seen in a long time. "It's 10 o'clock at night," I protested. "It's freezing out there." "We'll be quick," Tommy promised. "It's only about 10 minutes away. Please, Mom." I don't know why I gave in. Maybe it was the way they looked at me, so earnest and excited, or maybe deep down, I was curious. Either way, I found myself bundling back up in my winter coat, grabbing my flashlight, one of those big, heavy mag lights that could double as a weapon if needed, and my old Minolta camera. I remembered it only had one exposure left on the film. "This better be worth it," I grumbled, following them out to the car. "And if you boys made these tracks yourselves, you're both grounded." The drive took us about 10 minutes outside of town, just as Tommy had said. We headed down Old Miller Road, past the Henderson farm, until Tommy suddenly told me to stop. "Pull over here," he directed, pointing to a spot where the road curved near a large open field. I pulled over, cutting the engine but leaving the headlights on. It was pitch black otherwise, with only a sliver of moon providing any natural light. The cold hit me like a wall when I stepped out of the car. Must have been 5 degrees, maybe less. "Where are these famous tracks?" I asked, my breath forming thick clouds in front of my face. "Over there," Tommy pointed across the field. "We need to walk about 20 feet in." I hesitated. Across the field? In the dark? "That's why we brought the flashlight," Tommy said, already trudging ahead. I wasn't happy about it. Walking across an unfamiliar field in the darkness, in freezing temperatures, seemed like a recipe for a broken ankle. But I followed them, shining my flashlight ahead of us as we made our way through the snow. The snow crunched beneath our boots, that distinctive sound of weight pressing on ice-crusted snow. I noticed something immediately. The crust was incredibly hard. When I deliberately stomped my heel down, I couldn't even make a dent. Weeks of freezing temperatures had turned the top layer into something like ice. "See? Right here," Tommy exclaimed, stopping suddenly. I aimed my flashlight where he was pointing, and what I saw made me freeze. There in the snow was a footprint, if you could call it that. It was enormous, round like a dinner plate, and sunk deep into the snow. Not just through the crust, but deep into the layers beneath. "What on earth?" I whispered, kneeling down to get a better look. The print was nothing like a human footprint. It wasn't elongated like a boot or shoe. It was almost perfectly round, maybe 15 inches across, with no distinct toe marks that I could see, just a massive round depression in the snow. "Look, there's more," Kevin said, pointing ahead. I raised my flashlight and sure enough, there was a line of these strange prints cutting across the pristine field. They were spaced far apart. So far that when I tried to step from one to the next, I couldn't. I would have had to jump, and even then, I'm not sure I could have made it. What made these? I asked, my skepticism rapidly dissolving. We think it's a Bigfoot, Tommy said, his voice quiet but excited. I almost laughed, but something stopped me. The tracks were real, that much was undeniable. And they certainly weren't made by the boys. Nothing could have broken through that crusted snow without significant weight, and the spacing between prints indicated something with a stride much longer than a human's. See how they're in a straight line? Tommy pointed out. He'd been studying animal tracking for years and knew what he was talking about. That means whatever made them walks on 2 legs, not 4. Bears and other animals leave staggered tracks. He was right. The prints formed a straight line heading toward the tree line about 100 yards away. And look how deep they are, he continued. Whatever made these is heavy, really heavy. I shone my flashlight around the surrounding snow. It was completely undisturbed except for these huge round depressions. No other marks, no signs of tampering or trickery. When did you boys find these? I asked, my voice coming out shakier than I intended. Around 8, Kevin replied. We were cutting across this field as a shortcut back from the creek when we spotted them. Did you see anything else? I asked, suddenly aware of how exposed we were in that open field, in the dark. They both shook their heads. Just the tracks, Tommy said. We followed them for a bit, but then it got too dark, so we went to get you. I raised my flashlight again, following the line of tracks toward the distant trees. They marched in a perfect line, approximately 5 or 6 feet between each one, heading straight for the woods that bordered Farmer Johnson's property. I want to take a picture, I decided, fumbling with my camera. Hold the flashlight on this print here. Tommy took the maglite and aimed it at the nearest print while I got my camera ready. I only had 1 shot left, so I took my time, making sure it was in focus before pressing the shutter. The flash briefly illuminated the field around us, and for a second I thought I saw something move at the edge of the tree line. Did you see that? I whispered, suddenly alert. See what? Tommy asked, peering into the darkness. I thought I saw something move by the trees. We all stood silent for a moment, straining to see or hear anything unusual. The night was completely still. That special kind of stillness that only happens in deep winter when the snow absorbs all sound. No wind, no animals, nothing. Then we heard it. A crack, like a branch breaking from the direction of the trees. Mom, Tommy said quietly, his earlier excitement replaced by apprehension. Let's head back to the car, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's too cold to stay out here anyway. We turned and started walking back toward the road, a bit faster than before. I couldn't help looking over my shoulder every few steps. The darkness beyond the reach of our flashlight seemed deeper somehow, more threatening. About halfway back to the car, we heard another crack, louder this time. Then something else, a sound I still can't properly describe, like a low, rumbling whoosh of air, almost like someone exhaling forcefully, but deeper, more guttural. Run, I said quietly, then louder. Run! We bolted for the car, slipping and stumbling through the snow. I remember the panic I felt, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking from cold and fear. Finally, I got the door open, and we all piled in. I started the engine and flipped the headlights to high beam, aiming them across the field. For a few seconds, we didn't see anything. Just the pristine white field with that line of massive round footprints cutting across it. Then, just at the edge of the headlight's reach, something moved. It was tall, so tall and dark, just a silhouette really. It seemed to hesitate at the edge of the light, then stepped back into the darkness of the trees. Did you see that? Kevin gasped. Holy shit! Did you see that? I did see it. But my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was too big to be a person, too upright to be a bear. The shape was all wrong, broad-shouldered and massive. We need to go, I said, throwing the car into drive. Now! I pulled away faster than was safe on that icy road, my heart pounding in my chest. Nobody spoke for several minutes. The heater blasted warm air, but I couldn't stop shaking. "What was that thing?" Tommy finally asked, his voice small. "I don't know," I admitted. "I honestly don't know." When we got home, I made the boys hot chocolate, and we sat at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The rational part of my brain kept searching for explanations. Maybe it was someone playing a prank, maybe it was a shadow, maybe our eyes were playing tricks on us. But then I remembered those tracks. Massive, round depressions punched deep into snow so hard I couldn't even dent it with my boot. The perfectly straight line they formed, the impossible distance between them. And that dark shape, standing well over 7 feet tall, watching us from the edge of the woods. I had the film developed a few days later. The picture of the footprint came out clearly, a perfect record of what we'd seen. I showed it to a few friends, and word got around. Soon, some local Bigfoot enthusiasts came to interview us and look at the photo. They were excited, saying it matched other reported Bigfoot prints. The county paper did a small story about it. Most people were skeptical, of course. A few even suggested it was an elaborate hoax, but they weren't there. They didn't see what broke through that ice-hard snow or what stood watching us from the tree line. It's been almost 40 years now. Tommy's grown with kids of his own. Kevin moved to Colorado after college. And I'm still here in Johnson County, an old woman now. I've never seen anything like those tracks again, never had another experience that I couldn't explain. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the snow is deep and the world is quiet, I find myself looking out my window toward the woods behind my house. I think about what's out there, moving through the trees, leaving those strange, round footprints that no human could make. I don't tell many people about that night anymore. They either don't believe me or they think I'm just a confused old lady. But I know what I saw. I know those tracks were real. And sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting, moving silently through the Kansas woods that most people think hold no mysteries. All I know for certain is that the world is stranger than we think. And some questions don't have easy answers. Those tracks in the snow taught me that much. And no matter how many winters pass, I'll never forget that night. The night I realized some legends might be more than just stories. Story 13. I guess I need to finally get this off my chest. I've been holding on to this experience for over 30 years now, and it still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. It happened back in October of 1991. I was 23 at the time, and my sister Patty was 20. We were living with our parents in their farmhouse in Miami County, Kansas, about 15 miles from the nearest proper town. Our house sat on this long, winding gravel road, surrounded by dense woods and farmland. Growing up there, I'd always been fascinated by stories of mysterious creatures, especially Bigfoot. I'd watched The Legend of Boggy Creek more times than I care to admit. My sister used to tease me about it, saying I was obsessed, and maybe I was. But the weird thing is, despite my fascination, I was absolutely terrified of actually seeing one in person. I'd have these nightmares where I'd be standing at my bedroom window and see a Sasquatch just staring back at me from the edge of the woods. I'd wake up in a cold sweat every time. The irony of what happened that night has never been lost on me. It was a Saturday in early October, unseasonably cold that year. Our parents had gone to visit our aunt in Topeka for the weekend, leaving Patty and me to watch the house. We weren't worried. We'd been left alone plenty of times before. After dinner, we settled in to watch Saturday Night Live, something we always did together when our parents were away. It was a little tradition of ours. The night was especially quiet. Our house was the only one for about a mile in either direction, and there was hardly any traffic on our road after dark. The wind had picked up a bit, making the old farmhouse creak and groan in that familiar way that I normally found comforting. But that night, for some reason, every sound seemed amplified. Around 1 in the morning, just as SNL was ending, our dog Sandy started barking outside. She was a German Shepherd mix, about 6 years old, and not the type to bark without reason. She was in her outdoor kennel that night because she'd been muddy from playing in the creek earlier. "What's she barking at?" Patty asked, looking up from the TV. I shrugged. "Probably just a raccoon or something." But Sandy didn't stop. Her barking got more frantic, almost desperate. That's when I started to feel uneasy. We'd had Sandy since she was a puppy, and I knew her different barks. This wasn't her "there's a squirrel" bark, or even her "someone's driving up" bark. This was different, more urgent. "Should we go check?" Patty asked, but I could tell she was nervous too. "Yeah, I guess we should," I said, even though part of me wanted to just turn up the TV and pretend we couldn't hear. We went to the front door together. Our house had this old wooden screen door that always squeaked when you opened it, and a heavy main door with a small window at eye level. I peered through that window first, but couldn't see much beyond our front porch. The security light at the end of our driveway cast long shadows across the yard. "I don't see anything," I said, but Sandy was still barking like crazy. Patty reached past me and flipped on the porch light. That's when my blood ran cold. Standing by our mailbox, about 30 yards from the house, was a massive, dark figure. It was hunched over, looking down at something on the ground. Even from that distance, I could tell it was huge, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. It wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. It had long arms that hung down almost to its knees, and it was covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. "Oh my God," Patty whispered beside me. "What is that?" I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up, and my whole body had gone rigid with fear. All I could think about were those scenes from Boggy Creek, especially the Travis Crabtree story where the creature approached their house at night. But this wasn't a movie. This was real, and it was standing right at the end of our driveway. The thing must have heard us because it suddenly stopped whatever it was doing and straightened up slightly. It didn't turn around fully, but it tilted its head as if listening. That small movement sent a wave of panic through me. I grabbed Patty's arm and pulled her away from the door. "We need a flashlight," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Dad keeps one in their bedroom." We hurried down the hallway to our parents' room, fumbling in the dark. I was terrified that at any moment we'd hear that screen door squeak open, announcing that the thing had decided to come inside. Patty found the flashlight in Dad's bedside drawer, and we rushed back to the front door, half expecting the creature to be standing on our porch. But when we looked out the window again, the figure was gone. "Where did it go?" Patty asked, her voice barely audible. Sandy was still barking, but now she sounded different, like she was tracking something. Her barks were moving around the perimeter of her kennel, following something we couldn't see. I don't know where I found the courage, but I opened the door a crack and shined the flashlight toward the mailbox. There was nothing there. I swept the beam across our front yard, the driveway, and the edge of the woods. Nothing. "Should we call someone?" Patty asked. "And tell them what? That we saw a monster by our mailbox?" I knew how it would sound. Rural Kansas wasn't exactly a hotbed of Bigfoot activity. The sheriff would either think we were playing a prank or that we'd seen a bear, which would be almost as frightening since bears weren't common in our area either. "Let's check on Sandy," I suggested. Her barking had subsided to a low growl now. We stepped onto the porch, clutching each other's hands. The night air was cold and damp, with that distinct October smell of decaying leaves and wood smoke. The security light cast everything in an eerie orange glow, making the shadows between the trees look deeper and darker than they should have. We made our way slowly down the porch steps, the flashlight beam bouncing with my shaking hand. Sandy's kennel was about 20 yards from the house, and with each step I expected that massive figure to emerge from the darkness. When we reached Sandy, she was pacing back and forth, her hackles raised. She whined when she saw us, pressing against the chain-link fence. I shined the flashlight around the kennel, half expecting to see massive footprints in the dirt, but the ground was hard-packed and it was too dark to make out any details. "What did you see, girl?" I whispered to Sandy, scratching her ears through the fence. Her whole body was trembling. That's when we heard it, a deep, throaty grunt from the woods behind the house. It wasn't a sound I recognized from any animal I knew. It was followed by the crack of breaking branches, as if something large was moving through the underbrush. Patty and I looked at each other, our eyes wide with fear. Without a word, we turned and ran back to the house, slamming and locking the door behind us. We closed all the curtains and blinds, turned on every light in the house, and huddled together on the couch, too scared to even speak. "What was that thing?" Patty finally whispered, after what felt like hours. "I don't know," I answered honestly. But I did know. At least I thought I did. It matched every description of a Bigfoot I'd ever heard or read about. The height, the hunched posture, the long arms, the dark fur. But saying it out loud seemed like it would make it too real. We stayed awake the rest of the night, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. I kept thinking about those stories from Boggy Creek, how the creatures would sometimes approach houses, peer in windows, even try to get inside. I wondered if it was still out there watching the house, waiting. When dawn finally came, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Whatever had been out there would surely be gone now. I went to let Sandy inside. She seemed calmer in the daylight, but still on edge. I scanned the yard and driveway, but couldn't bring myself to walk out to the mailbox or check the woods. Part of me wanted to look for footprints or other evidence. The other part, the part that was still trembling with fear, didn't want confirmation of what I'd seen. Our parents came home later that day. We didn't tell them what had happened. What could we say? That we'd seen Bigfoot checking out our mailbox. It sounded ridiculous even to me, and I'd seen it with my own eyes. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep through the night. I'd wake up at the slightest sound, convinced that the creature had returned. I kept having this recurring nightmare where I'd hear Sandy barking, look out my window, and see that massive dark figure standing right outside, staring back at me with glowing eyes. We never saw it again, at least not directly. But there were times when Sandy and our other dog would start barking frantically at night for no apparent reason. Times when I'd feel watched while hanging laundry out back, or when I'd hear strange sounds from the woods that didn't quite match any animal I knew. About a month after the incident, I finally worked up the courage to talk to Patty about it again. We were alone in the house, folding laundry in the living room. "Do you ever think about that night?" I asked her. She nodded slowly. "All the time. I still don't know what it was." "Do you think it was—" I couldn't bring myself to say the word. "A Bigfoot," she finished for me. "I don't know. I never believed in that stuff before, but I know what I saw, and it wasn't a bear or a person in a costume." "Have you told anyone?" She shook her head. "Who would believe us?" That's the thing that's haunted me all these years, the isolation of knowing something that sounds too incredible to share. I've read accounts of other Bigfoot sightings since then, and so many of them echo our experience. The creature's posture, the way it moved, the sounds it made. Sometimes I wonder how many other people are out there, keeping similar encounters to themselves for fear of ridicule. I still live in Kansas, though not in that same house. I moved to a suburb of Kansas City years ago, where the neighborhoods are close together and the woods are far away. But I still can't shake the memory of that night. The massive silhouette by our mailbox, the way it tilted its head when it heard us. The bone-deep terror I felt, knowing that something that shouldn't exist was right outside our home. Sometimes when I visit my parents, they still live in that house, Sandy's replacement, another German shepherd named Duke, will suddenly stop playing, stand at attention, and stare intently at the woods beyond the yard. In those moments, I get that same crawling sensation up my spine that I felt that October night. Like something's watching, waiting. I don't watch Bigfoot documentaries anymore. I don't need to. I've seen one with my own eyes. And while part of me has always wondered what would have happened if we'd been braver that night, if we'd gone outside with the flashlight immediately instead of retreating to find a better one, the larger part of me is grateful for that delay. Because whatever was standing by our mailbox that night wasn't something I was meant to see up close. I still don't know what it wanted or why it was there. Was it just passing through? Was it curious about our home? Or was there something more sinister to its presence? These are the questions that keep me awake sometimes, even 30 years later. All I know for sure is that something was outside our house that night. Something large, something unnatural, something that shouldn't exist, but does. And the thought that it might still be out there, perhaps watching other isolated homes on dark October nights, makes me grateful for my locked doors, closed neighbors, and the distance between me and those Kansas woods. Story 14. I never believed all those Bigfoot stories. I'm not a gullible person, and I've always prided myself on keeping a level head. But what happened that day in May of 1996 changed everything I thought I knew about our world. It's been nagging at me for years now, and I finally need to get this off my chest, even if most people will think I've lost my mind. I live on the edge of Fort Scott, Kansas, where the neighborhoods give way to more open spaces. My house backs up to the old golf course, with tree lines marking the boundaries between civilization and the more wild areas beyond. It's quiet here, or at least it was back then. May 19th, 1996 was just a regular Sunday evening. I remember the date clearly because it was my day off, and I'd spent most of it doing yard work and watching NASCAR. The Winston Select 500 was on that afternoon. Around 7 in the evening, the sky started to darken with rain clouds moving in. My dog Rex, a chocolate lab mix, had been outside in the backyard on his run for about an hour. He's usually pretty quiet, but he started acting strange, pacing back and forth at the end of his lead and whining. I figured he needed to come in before the rain started, so I grabbed his treats from the kitchen counter and headed out the back door. The air felt heavy with incoming rain, that specific smell and pressure change that comes right before a storm. I remember noticing how unnaturally silent everything had become. No birds, no distant traffic noise, just this eerie stillness broken only by Rex's occasional whining. As I approached him, I noticed he wasn't looking at me, but staring intently toward the golf course and the tree line beyond. His ears were perked forward, and his body was rigid in that alert posture dogs get when they've spotted something concerning. "What's got you all worked up, buddy?" I asked as I unclipped his lead. The plastic clasp made that little click sound, and Rex immediately pressed himself against my leg instead of bounding toward the house like he usually would. That's when a few drops of rain started to hit my arms. I stood up straight, intending to hustle Rex back to the house before we both got soaked. That's when I saw it. Across the golf course, right at the edge of the tree line, maybe 200 yards away, something moved. At first I thought it might be a golfer trying to finish their round before the rain, but the course had been empty all evening due to the threatening weather. Besides, even from that distance, I could tell this was much too large to be a person. This thing emerged from the trees, dark brown, almost black in the dimming evening light. It moved on 2 legs, but in a way that seemed both fluid and awkward at the same time. Not like a human walks, more like how an athlete might run through tires in a training exercise, but natural, like that was its normal gait. Its arms were long, swinging with a purpose that seemed almost deliberate. For about 5 or 6 seconds, it moved across an open clearing between 2 sections of trees, maybe 20 yards of exposed ground. The whole time, I stood frozen, one hand still on Rex's collar, unable to process what I was seeing. The creature was covered in what looked like hair or fur, and even from that distance I could tell it was massive, 7 feet tall at minimum, with a bulk that no human could match. Rex let out a low growl, so quiet I could barely hear it, but I felt the vibration through my hand on his collar. The creature's head snapped in our direction, and for a split second I had the distinct, terrifying feeling of making eye contact across that distance. My heart practically stopped. Then it was gone, disappearing back into the tree line with surprising speed and grace for something so large. The whole encounter lasted maybe 5 or 6 seconds, but time felt warped. When it vanished, I suddenly became aware that I'd been holding my breath. The rain started to come down harder, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Jesus Christ, I whispered to myself, still staring at the spot where it had disappeared. Rex was still pressed against my leg, trembling slightly, his eyes fixed on the same spot. I hurried Rex inside, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? I'm not the type to jump to conclusions, but there was something so familiar about the way it moved. It hit me as I was locking the back door, the Patterson-Gimlin footage. I'd seen that famous film of an alleged Bigfoot a few times on TV specials, and the similarity in movement was uncanny. The same rolling gait, the same swing of the arms. But this was Fort Scott, Kansas, not the Pacific Northwest. We don't have Bigfoot here, or so I'd always thought. I poured myself a stiff bourbon with shaking hands and sat at my kitchen table. Rex wouldn't leave my side, occasionally whining and looking toward the back door. The rain was coming down in sheets now, drumming against the roof and windows. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But I knew that wasn't right. Bears don't walk that distance upright, and besides, black bears are rare in this part of Kansas. A person in a costume. But who would be out there in the approaching storm? And why? The movement was too natural, too fluid, yet inhuman. I barely slept that night. Every noise outside had me sitting bolt upright, wondering if that thing was near my house. Rex slept on my bed, something I normally didn't allow, but I found his presence comforting. He kept raising his head at the slightest sounds, his ears twitching. The next morning I called in sick to work. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I spent the day researching Bigfoot sightings on my computer. This was 1996, so the internet wasn't what it is today, but there were some forums and websites dedicated to cryptid sightings. I found myself falling down a rabbit hole of reports, some in areas not too far from Fort Scott. Eastern Kansas, western Missouri, northern Oklahoma. There were more sightings than I would have expected. Looking back, I should have gone to check for tracks right away, but in my shocked state, it didn't occur to me until nearly a week later. By then, we'd had several hard rains, and any evidence was long gone. I walked the tree line anyway, searching for broken branches, hair samples, anything unusual, but found nothing conclusive. Just some areas where the underbrush seemed pressed down in wide paths, which could have been made by anything. I became borderline obsessed in the following weeks. I bought a cheap video camera and set it up on a tripod facing the tree line from my back porch. I'd let it run for hours while I was home, hoping to catch another glimpse. I interviewed neighbors casually, asking if they'd seen anything unusual without revealing what I'd seen. Nobody had any stories that matched mine, though old Mrs. Keller, who lived 2 houses down, mentioned that her bird feeders had been mysteriously emptied and damaged several times that spring. I started taking Rex on longer walks along the edges of the golf course, always keeping my eyes on the tree line. He was much more alert on these walks than he'd ever been before, often stopping to sniff intensely at certain spots near the trees. Once or twice, he refused to go down specific paths, pulling back on his leash and whining until I changed direction. About 2 months after the sighting, on a muggy July evening, I was grilling on my back porch with Rex lying nearby. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Rex suddenly stood up, hackles raised, staring toward the same tree line. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up as I followed his gaze. For several long seconds I saw nothing. Then there was a subtle movement, just the slightest shifting of shadows, deeper than they should have been. Something was watching us from just inside the tree line, partially hidden behind a large oak. Even with the distance, I could make out a dark shape that didn't belong, taller than a man. Rex let out a low growl, and the shape receded deeper into the trees until it was gone. I abandoned my half-cooked burgers and hustled Rex inside, my appetite completely gone. That night, I thought I heard wood knocking sounds from the direction of the trees. 2 distinct knocks, followed by a pause, then 3 more. It could have been anything, a woodpecker, branches hitting together in the breeze, but after everything that had happened, it felt deliberate, like communication. Over the next few months, I had a few more potential sightings, always brief, always at dusk or dawn, always too far away or too obscured to be certain. Strange sounds in the night became common enough that I started recording them on cassette tapes. Sometimes it was the knocking, other times what sounded like whoops or calls that didn't match any local wildlife I was familiar with. By the fall, the sightings and sounds had tapered off. I kept up my vigilance, but deep down, I knew whatever had been there was likely gone. In November of that year, I learned why. The local paper announced plans for expanding the golf course, adding 9 new holes that would cut right through the wooded area where I'd had my sightings. Construction was set to begin the following spring. The winter passed quietly. I continued my research, joining a few Bigfoot research organizations and corresponding with other witnesses by mail. I learned that Bigfoot sightings often occur in transitional zones, areas where human development is encroaching on wilderness, and frequently stop once heavy construction begins. In March of 1997, the bulldozers arrived. I watched from my back porch as they began clearing the trees, feeling a strange sense of loss. Whatever had been out there, and I was increasingly convinced it was indeed a Sasquatch, would have been driven away by the noise and destruction of its habitat. By summer, the new addition to the golf course was taking shape. The dense woods had been reduced to carefully placed clusters of trees between manicured fairways. The mystery and wildness were gone, replaced by sprinklers and golf carts. I never saw anything unusual there again. In the years since, I've moved deeper into town as Fort Scott has grown. That edge of wilderness feeling my old place had is gone now, replaced by more houses, a strip mall, and plenty of traffic. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I listen to those old tape recordings, trying to convince myself that what I heard was just normal forest sounds. But then I remember that rainy evening in May, and how for 5 or 6 seconds I saw something that shouldn't exist walking across that clearing. I still have Rex, old and arthritic now, but sometimes when we drive near wooded areas, he'll suddenly become alert, staring into the trees with that same intensity he had back then. It makes me wonder if there are more of them out there, retreating further and further from our expanding civilization, occasionally seen by lucky or unlucky people who, like me, will never forget those few seconds that changed their understanding of the world. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw that evening in 1996, and no amount of rationalization can change that. Something huge and unknown was passing through Fort Scott, perhaps the last of its kind in this area, moving on as we claimed more and more of its territory. I only hope that somewhere, in some remote forest still untouched by development, it found a place to exist in peace. Story 15. Assam. I've never really told anyone about this, besides Jerry and a couple of close family members years later. Even now, I'm not sure if I should be writing this down, but it's been 70 years and I still remember it clear as day. I figure if I don't tell someone, This memory dies with me, and maybe someone else has seen what I saw. It was the summer of '53. I was 13 that year, spending the summer at my uncle's farm in Henry County, Alabama. My parents thought the country air would be good for me, and I loved being with my cousins anyway. My cousin Jerry was 16, and we were as close as siblings, despite only seeing each other during summer breaks. That particular day in July was brutally hot. The kind of Alabama heat that makes the air feel thick enough to cut with a knife. The humidity had to be near 100%, and my cotton dress was sticking to my back before we even started working. Uncle Robert had us out in the cornfield early that morning. The corn was about chest high on me then, and our job was to apply soda to the base of each plant. Uncle said it helped them grow stronger, though all I knew was it was tedious work that kept us bent over for hours. Jerry and I had been working our way down the row since about 7 that morning. We each had a bucket of the soda mixture, and we'd scoop a little out with a tin cup to pour around the base of each stalk. We'd been at it for hours, and my back was aching something fierce. The sun was directly overhead by then, beating down on us without mercy. "Emma, I'm about to shrivel up and blow away," Jerry complained, wiping sweat from his forehead with his forearm. His red hair was dark with sweat, plastered to his head. "I need some water real bad." I was thirsty too, but we'd finished our canteen about an hour earlier. "Should we head back to the house?" I asked hopefully. The farmhouse was a good half-mile walk across the fields. "Nah, Uncle Robert'll have a fit if we don't finish this section before lunch," Jerry said. He straightened up, stretching his back, and then pointed to a small house visible in the distance. "Mrs. Halloway's place is just down that dirt road. Why don't you run and ask her for some water? She won't mind." Mrs. Halloway was an elderly widow who lived in a small white house that sat alone on the edge of my uncle's property. She was friendly enough, though I didn't know her well. Her house was the only one on that dirt road that cut between 2 sections of my uncle's land. "Why me?" I protested, though I was already setting my bucket down. Any excuse for a break was welcome. "Because you're faster," Jerry grinned, "and because I said so." I rolled my eyes but didn't argue. The truth was, I was glad for the chance to stretch my legs and get out of the cornfield for a few minutes. "Fine, give me the canteen," I said, holding out my hand. Jerry passed it over, and I started off toward the edge of the field where it met the dirt road. The road was rarely used except by my uncle and occasionally Mrs. Halloway's son when he came to visit. It was really just 2 ruts with tall grass growing down the middle, stretching about a quarter-mile from the main county road to Mrs. Halloway's house. On both sides of the road was thick forest, old-growth pine and oak that hadn't been cleared for farming. Those woods stretched for miles, all the way to the state line. I was grateful for the moment alone. The day was still stifling hot, but at least I was moving instead of bent over corn plants. I remember humming to myself as I walked, swinging the empty canteen by its strap. The cicadas were so loud that day, making that rising and falling buzz. That's the soundtrack of every southern summer. I'd gone maybe 100 yards down that dirt road when I saw them. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. They were standing on the opposite side of the road, just at the edge where the forest began, about 10 feet away from me. 2 figures, covered in dark hair. For a split second I thought they might be bears standing on their hind legs, but that didn't make sense. We didn't have bears in Henry County, not that I'd ever heard of. I stopped dead in my tracks. The canteen slipped from my fingers and hit the dirt with a dull thud. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. The taller one was maybe 5 feet tall, about my height, and the shorter one couldn't have been more than 4 feet. They stood upright on 2 legs, just like humans, but they were covered from head to toe in dark brownish-black hair. Not fur exactly, but hair, shaggy and thick. Their bodies were muscular, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past their knees. Their faces are what I remember most clearly. They weren't animal faces, not exactly. They were more human-like, but still covered in that same dark hair, except for their noses, which were bare and a dark brownish-black color. Their eyes were set deep under heavy brow ridges, and they were looking right at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just stood there, paralyzed, as they stood there watching me. They didn't make any threatening moves. They didn't make any sounds. We just stood there, the three of us, staring at each other across that dusty road. Time seemed to stretch out. It couldn't have been more than a minute that we stood there, but it felt like an eternity. I remember noticing small details, how the smaller one stood slightly behind the larger one, how they seemed to breathe heavily in the summer heat, how their eyes blinked occasionally as they studied me. Then something inside me snapped. I don't know if it was fear finally kicking in or just self-preservation, but suddenly I could move again. I bent down, never taking my eyes off them, and grabbed the canteen. Then, without any conscious decision, I turned and ran. I didn't run back to Jerry. For some reason, my feet carried me toward Mrs. Halloway's house instead. Maybe because it was closer, or maybe because some instinct told me not to lead these creatures back to my cousin. I ran as fast as I've ever run in my life, the empty canteen bouncing against my hip, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I reached Mrs. Halloway's front porch in what felt like seconds, though it must have been longer. I remember pounding on her door, gasping for breath, sweat pouring down my face. When she answered, I couldn't even speak at first. "Land sakes, child, what's got into you?" she asked, her wrinkled face concerned as she ushered me inside. Her house was dim and cool compared to the blazing sun outside, and it smelled of lavender and furniture polish. "Water," I managed to gasp, partly because I was genuinely thirsty now after my sprint, and partly because I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd seen. "For Jerry. We're working in the cornfield." Mrs. Halloway looked at me strangely but didn't press. She took the canteen and filled it from her kitchen pump, then added some ice from her icebox, which was a real luxury in those days. "You sit a minute and catch your breath," she said, guiding me to a chair at her kitchen table. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I sat there, trying to compose myself while Mrs. Halloway puttered around her kitchen, occasionally glancing at me with concern. Through her front window, I could see the dirt road I'd just run down. There was no sign of the creatures. After a few minutes, when my breathing had returned to something close to normal, I thanked Mrs. Halloway and left, the now heavy canteen clutched tightly in my hands. I walked back down that dirt road, my eyes darting nervously from side to side, expecting to see those hairy figures emerge from the trees at any moment. But there was nothing, just the empty road, the buzzing cicadas, and the oppressive heat. When I reached Jerry, he was sitting in the shade of a tall corn plant, looking irritated. "What took you so long?" he demanded, grabbing for the canteen. "I was about to come looking for you." I opened my mouth to tell him, then closed it again. Even though what I'd seen was as real to me as Jerry sitting there in front of me, I couldn't make the words come out. Who would believe such a thing? I'd be laughed at, or worse, thought to be making up stories for attention. "Mrs. Halloway was talking my ear off," I lied, watching as Jerry gulped down the water. "You know how she gets." Jerry didn't question it. We went back to work on the corn plants, but I couldn't focus. My hands were shaking, and I kept looking over my shoulder toward the dirt road. Every rustle in the cornfield made me jump. By the time we finished our work and headed back to the farmhouse for lunch, I'd almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just the heat playing tricks on my eyes. Maybe I'd seen a couple of deer or some other animals, and my mind had turned them into something else. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those creatures standing there, watching me with those deep-set eyes. I kept thinking about what they were. They weren't bears or any other animal I knew of. They walked upright like humans, but were covered in hair like apes. But we didn't have apes in Alabama. The next morning, I snuck out early and went back to that spot on the dirt road. I don't know what I expected to find. Footprints maybe, or some other sign that what I'd seen was real. But the ground was hard-packed dirt, and if there had been any marks, they were gone now. I did notice something, though. At the edge of the forest where they had been standing, some of the underbrush was crushed down, as if something heavy had been standing there, and on a nearby sapling about 5 feet off the ground, there was a clump of dark hair caught on the rough bark. I reached out and touched it. It was coarse and wiry, not like human hair and not quite like animal fur either, something in between. I pulled it free and held it in my palm, staring at it. This was proof. This was real. But proof of what? I had no idea what to call the creatures I'd seen. This was decades before all those Bigfoot shows on TV, before the Patterson-Gimlin film, before any of that entered the public consciousness. In 1953, in rural Alabama, there was no framework for understanding what I'd encountered. I kept that clump of hair for years, hidden in a small tin box under my bed. Eventually, during a move in my 20s, the box went missing. Sometimes I wonder if that's for the best. What would I do with it now? Who would believe me anyway? I never saw the creatures again, though for the rest of that summer, I refused to go down that dirt road alone. Jerry thought I was being silly, but he didn't press me on it. When school started back in the fall, and I returned home to Birmingham, the incident began to feel more and more like a strange dream. It wasn't until years later, in the 70s, when Bigfoot and Sasquatch started appearing in newspapers and TV shows, that I began to wonder if that's what I had seen. The descriptions matched. The upright posture, the hair-covered bodies, the somewhat human-like faces. But most accounts were of single, adult creatures, not what appeared to be juveniles like I had seen. Now, all these years later, I still wonder about them. Where did they come from? Where did they go? Were they passing through, or do they still live in those woods? Did anyone else ever see them? I'm an old woman now, and most of the people from that time in my life are long gone. My cousin Jerry passed 20 years ago, without ever knowing what I saw that day. My uncle's farm was sold decades ago, and I don't know what's become of that dirt road or Mrs. Halloway's house, but I know what I saw. 2 hair-covered creatures standing upright, watching me with intelligent eyes across a dusty Alabama dirt road in the summer of '53. I don't expect to be believed. I barely believe it myself sometimes. But it happened, exactly as I've described it, and not a summer goes by that I don't think about that day in the cornfield, when for one brief moment I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably does.